Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It started with a question that seemed insignificant at first, like any other. Did you feel that? But when it was asked in the small town of Pinsk, it didn't take long for the whole place to notice the oddness in the air. The same air they had breathed all their lives, now thick with an invisible weight, a pressing sensation that lingered in the back of your mind, leaving you uncertain. At night, the air smelled different. A mixture of decay, something sharp, but also sweet. And the sounds, they were off. Andrei, the town's quiet librarian, was the first to notice it. He had lived here all his 32 years, never one to make a fuss. He'd read the same books, walked the same streets, yet something felt wrong. That night, as he walked home through the usual winding path past the old church, he felt it. A faint humming sound, like a breeze, only it wasn't coming from the trees. It came from within him, or so it seemed. A shiver ran down his spine. The air felt thicker than it should. Every step he took seemed to echo louder than it ought to. He rubbed his arms, fighting the strange prickling on his skin, as if someone was watching from the shadows. But when he turned, there was no one. He quickened his pace, hands clenching the book bag he carried. The town was so quiet that even the usual night sounds seemed muffled, swallowed by the strange presence that clung to the space around him. Reaching his small apartment, Andrei shut the door behind him with a sense of relief. He tossed his bag onto the couch and walked over to the window. From there, he saw nothing out of the ordinary, the same dim glow of the street lamp, the same distant rustling of the trees. But then his eyes caught something. A shadow flickered across the street. Not from a car, no. It was too quick, too fluid. A movement that didn't belong. He turned away from the window. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself, trying to dismiss the unease that had already settled into his bones. The silence outside was now deafening, almost suffocating. The hum, if it was a hum at all, seemed louder. Andrei tried to sleep that night, but the sound, that thing, persisted. It was as if the world had become a living creature, its breath in sync with his own, slowly crushing him from the inside. The next morning, Andrei noticed the air had changed again. It wasn't just a smell or a hum now. People in the town started talking, asking each other the same question, that familiar uncertainty creeping into their voices. The streets felt different, even in the light of day. There was an unsettling energy in the air that no one could explain. "Did you hear it too?" asked Luba, the baker, as she handed him his morning bread. Her face was pale, eyes wide with something he couldn't quite place. She leaned in closer. "Last night, it was like someone was calling me." Andrei nodded but said nothing, feeling the weight of the words. Luba wasn't the only one. The more Andrei walked around town, the more he heard it, whispers of strange sounds, of movements out of the corner of their eyes. Things felt off. They had all felt it. But no one spoke about it openly. It was as if they were all too afraid to ask what it meant, afraid of what might answer them. That evening, Andrei stood in his living room again, gazing out the window. The shadows were longer, darker, and the faint flicker of the street lamp seemed to stutter, like a malfunctioning light, but it didn't go away. As he stared out, the humming returned, faint at first, but growing stronger. Andre stepped back from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. Was it just his imagination? Or was something really out there? The air felt cold now, biting. His breath misted in the room. The quiet stillness was suffocating. Andre closed his eyes, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling at the back of his mind. Maybe tomorrow it would be better. Maybe the strange air would pass, and everything would go back to normal. But deep down, Andre knew it wouldn't. Something had shifted, and it wasn't going to let go. As the days went on, more people began speaking of their own experiences. Old man Zahar, who sat by the square every day, swore he had seen a shadow that moved on its own. It wasn't a trick of the light, he insisted. It looked at me, he said, his voice trembling. Each night, the air grew heavier. The smell lingered longer. And the humming, it wasn't just in the wind anymore. It felt like it was in their very bones. It wasn't long before Andre began to hear things that weren't there. Voices, soft whispers, a name he couldn't understand, calls from places he couldn't see. The trees outside seemed to move of their own accord, their branches twisting in unnatural ways. The sound of someone walking behind him, footsteps echoing louder and louder in his ears. But when he turned, nothing. Was it the air? Or was it something else? Andre had started questioning his own sanity. But the more he wondered, the more the whispers seemed to reach into his thoughts, wrapping themselves around his mind. The town had become a ghost town in the daylight, and each night the shadows stretched further. Even his apartment felt different now. The air in his room was thicker, the corners of the room darker. His own breath seemed louder in his ears. What had begun as an unsettling shift in the air now felt like something much worse. Something was coming. But what? The town had always been small, predictable, and safe. Now it was neither. The oddness in the air had become unbearable, and with each passing night, Andre felt himself slipping further into something he couldn't explain. The whispers, at first subtle and fleeting, now seemed to call to him from the shadows. He would wake in the dead of night, the room completely still, only to hear his name softly echoed through the dark. It was never a loud sound, never clear, but enough to send a cold shiver down his spine. Was it just his mind playing tricks on him, or was something truly watching him? By day, the town looked unchanged, the same faces going about their routines. But everyone felt it, the air thick with an unspoken tension. They spoke less, their eyes darting around nervously. No one wanted to acknowledge the obvious. Something was wrong, something was there. The more Andre tried to ignore it, the worse it became. His mind was beginning to fray at the edges. It wasn't just the whispers anymore, he'd see things out of the corner of his eye. Shadows that stretched too long, or figures that didn't quite fit the surroundings. His gaze would lock on something just out of focus, and when he blinked, it was gone. But the feeling would remain. One night, unable to sleep, Andre ventured out of his apartment. He had to find answers. He had to see if anyone else had felt what he had. Maybe it was the town itself. Maybe it was something in the air. He wasn't sure anymore, but he couldn't stay locked inside. As he walked down the narrow streets, the usual quiet of the town felt heavier. The night was cold, and the trees swayed in the wind, but the familiar rustling seemed different. Like it was alive, bending to some unseen force. Andre's eyes darted around, half expecting to see something in the darkness. The air around him felt tighter, almost suffocating, and his breathing quickened. He was hyper-aware of every small detail, every crack in the pavement, every breath of wind that passed by him. He arrived at the town square, where the street lamp flickered as usual. It was the place where the townsfolk gathered in the mornings, but tonight it was empty. Except for one person, Luba, the baker, who stood in the center of the square, her eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't move when Andre approached, and for a moment he thought she hadn't noticed him. But then she turned her head slowly, her eyes vacant, as if she were looking right through him. Andre, her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. He froze, his heart racing. Luba, are you okay? Her gaze lingered on him for a long moment before she whispered again, "They're coming." Her lips trembled, as if the words themselves were too heavy to speak. Before he could respond, she slowly turned away, walking toward the edge of the square. Andre reached out, but she didn't stop. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, and she didn't seem to care about the direction she was heading. Her face was pale, as if the color had drained from her skin. He followed her instinctively, but as they walked further into the darkness, he began to notice something strange. The street lamps flickered more intensely now, casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones. The ground beneath his feet felt softer, almost as if it was shifting with each step. He looked up at the sky. It was darker than it should be, no stars to be seen, just a thick, swirling blackness. And then he heard it, the hum. It was louder now, a constant buzzing in the air, like an electric charge. It vibrated in his chest, rattled his bones. Luba didn't seem to hear it. She just kept walking, her steps unchanging. Andre's breath caught in his throat as the darkness grew heavier around them. They reached the old church at the far end of the square, its tall spires looming like twisted fingers against the dark sky. The door to the church was ajar, an invitation or a warning. Luba didn't hesitate. She stepped inside, disappearing into the gloom. Andre hesitated. Every part of him told him to turn back, but something pulled him forward. He stepped through the door. The air inside the church was cold, colder than it should be. His footsteps echoed through the vast emptiness. The once familiar scent of incense and wood had been replaced by something foul, like rot, mixed with that strange sweet odor that had been growing stronger with each passing day. And then he saw it. In the center of the altar, a figure stood, motionless. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that seemed to stretch beyond human proportions. It had no face, only a shifting mass of shadows that writhed like smoke. Its body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, never fully solid. Andre's heart slammed in his chest. His breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. The figure didn't move, but Andre could feel its presence, a pull, like gravity itself was shifting in its favor. Luba was nowhere to be seen. The church had become a labyrinth of shifting shadows. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavier with each breath he took. "They're coming." Luba's words echoed in his mind, and he understood now. The thing in front of him, it wasn't the only one. There were more. And then, the figure moved. Not in a way that made sense. It didn't walk, didn't run. It simply shifted closer, its form distorting with each second, as if it was tearing through the very fabric of reality itself. Andre stumbled back, his mind racing. He had to get out. He couldn't fight this, whatever it was. But as he turned to flee, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. The darkness closed in around him. The hum grew louder, the air thicker. He was trapped. And then he heard the voice, not from his ears, but from inside his mind. "We've been waiting." Andre's breath came in sharp gasps, his body trembling from more than just fear. He could feel the presence closing in around him, suffocating him. The air was thick with an almost palpable weight, as if the very walls of the church were pressing in on him. The shadows seemed to stretch and pulse, alive in ways they shouldn't be. He had to escape. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The weight of the room, of the entity before him, seemed to freeze him in place. "We've been waiting," the voice echoed again, inside his head, so close it felt as if it was whispered directly into his ear. But there was no one there. The figure, whatever it was, had not moved since it first appeared. Yet, Andre felt its presence like a hand on his chest, suffocating him. Desperation clawed at him. He needed to think, to do something. His gaze darted around the room, searching for any way out, but the church had transformed into a maze of shadows, its windows black as pitch, no moonlight or stars to offer any relief. The altar, where the creature stood, flickered in and out of existence like a mirage. It wasn't solid, wasn't even truly there in a way that Andre could comprehend. It was something else entirely, something wrong. He couldn't focus on it too long without feeling his mind start to unravel, as though staring at it too closely would destroy what little sanity he had left. A cold sweat ran down the back of his neck as he took a step back, then another. He tried to whisper to himself, some rational thought to ground him, but it was hard to concentrate with the humming growing louder, swirling through the air like a terrible storm. Andre's hand brushed against something cold, the sharp edge of a wooden pew. It creaked under his touch, sending a shiver through him. For a fleeting moment, the sound seemed normal, like a reminder of the real world. But then, the church shifted again. The pew seemed to stretch, elongating, warping into something unfamiliar. He stumbled back, his heart pounding faster. The creature, it wasn't just standing anymore. It was closer now, its form distorting with every second. It wasn't walking, it wasn't even moving. It shifted, bending the space around it like light bending through glass. Every time Andre blinked, it was in a different place, and each time it was closer. "We're everywhere," the voice whispered again, reverberating in his skull, drowning out all other thought. Andre shook his head, trying to clear his mind. This couldn't be real. He had to be imagining it. This wasn't possible. But every movement, every flicker of the creature confirmed it. The fear started to blur with something worse, doubt. He turned toward the door, his legs finally answering his frantic thoughts. He had to get out. He bolted toward it, his hand reaching for the handle, but when he pulled, the door wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, his knuckles turning white, but it was as if the door itself had become part of the wall. It wasn't just locked. It was gone. A deep, guttural laugh filled the room. Not from the figure, from within the room itself. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the walls, the air, the shadows were all in on the joke. The hum grew louder, faster, more intense. It was inside his head now, rattling his skull, making him want to claw at his own mind. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head, but nothing could block the sound, the sensation of the thing that was all around him, watching, waiting. Through the haze of terror, he heard a noise behind him, soft at first, like footsteps, but heavier, like something dragging itself across the floor. He dared not look, but he felt it. The presence was growing. And then, the whisper returned, sharp and urgent. "We're inside you." Andre's heart skipped a beat. The air around him felt like it was closing in on his lungs, squeezing out the breath from his chest. He looked up, and the creature was no longer in front of him. It was above, towering over him in a form that was both familiar and alien. It had no face, no expression, just a twisting, undulating mass of shadows that barely resembled anything human at all. Its form was constantly shifting, stretching, as if it couldn't stay in one shape for too long. Andre's throat constricted. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His eyes searched for an escape, for some kind of hope, but there was nothing. The door was still gone. The church had become a prison. The walls were closing in. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a figure appeared from the darkness. Luba. She was standing near the altar now, staring at him with vacant eyes. But this time, she wasn't Luba. The woman standing before him had the same face, the same body, but her movements were wrong. She was too still, too perfect, as though she were a puppet held by strings. She raised her hand toward him, her fingers long and bent at unnatural angles. She spoke, but it wasn't her voice. It was the same voice as the creature, the same whisper that had been echoing in his mind. Andre's own face stared back at him, though it wasn't him. It was a reflection of himself, twisted and wrong. His doppelganger. His eyes were black, hollowed out, as if there was nothing inside but emptiness. The figure spoke. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice a perfect mimicry of Andre's own, but colder, emptier. "You belong to this now. You are part of the darkness. There is no way back." Andre staggered back, his legs giving out beneath him. The room tilted, and he collapsed to the ground. His heart was a drumbeat in his chest, drawing out everything else. The figure took a step forward, its every movement unnatural, as if it were walking through thick fog. The church had become a prison. There was no way out. The walls, the shadows, the whispers, they were all him, and he was them. The boundaries between reality and nightmare had dissolved. There was nothing left. The last thing Andre heard, before the darkness fully overtook him, was a whisper in his ear, cold and final. "We are you." Andre's eyes fluttered open, but the world around him was nothing but a blur of shifting shadows. He could barely make sense of where he was. Was he still in the church? Was he even still in the same reality? The silence pressed in on him, so thick it was suffocating, filling his ears with a buzzing that felt like it was coming from the very marrow of his bones. The last thing he remembered was the figure, the twisted reflection of himself. It had been so real, so wrong. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Or had the thing, whatever it was, truly consumed him? He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as if they were no longer his own. Every part of him felt sluggish, detached. Slowly, he pushed himself up from the ground, his hands scraping against something rough and cold. The air tasted bitter, like metal, and the room felt suffocating, its contours distorted, almost breathing in rhythm with his own pulse. He could hear it now, footsteps, soft and rhythmic, pacing slowly in the distance. They were too familiar. Too close. Andre stood up, his body shaking with fear and confusion, but his feet didn't move where he wanted them to. The space around him felt endless, a labyrinth of endless corridors, yet the walls seemed to stretch and shrink, bending under some unseen pressure. He could no longer tell which way was the door, or if there was even a way out. "You cannot leave," the voice echoed through his head, louder now, more urgent. It wasn't the same voice as before. This was his own. It came from deep within, from the parts of him he had buried long ago. The floor beneath his feet shifted again, as if it were alive. He could feel the air thickening, the weight of it pressing against his chest like an invisible hand. His breath was shallow, and every exhale felt like it would be his last. And then, a faint rustle, a whisper of movement. He turned, his heart racing. It was her again. Luba's face, so familiar, yet alien, emerged from the shadows. But there was no warmth in her expression, no recognition. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and empty, like a hollow shell. She was not her anymore. She had become a part of it. Whatever it was. Her mouth parted, but no words came. The only sound was the low hum that filled the air, that same unsettling noise that had plagued him from the start. Her form flickered, shifting in and out of focus, like she was caught between two worlds, struggling to hold onto her shape. Andrei stepped back, his mind spinning. The world around him seemed to fold, every corner of the space twisting and warping. The church, the house, the trees, everything had melted into a singular, endless void. He could feel himself slipping, like he was being pulled under the surface of water, dragged into a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. "It's too late," Luba's voice finally came, not from her lips, but from the air itself. "There's no escape from this. No way back. We are one now." Andrei's breath caught in his throat. The words were chilling, but it was the tone that terrified him the most. It wasn't just a voice. It was his own, twisted, like a mockery of everything he had ever believed. The world around him began to fracture, the edges of the room splintering into pieces, like glass breaking apart. The shadows swirled faster, darker, the hum growing louder, merging with the sound of his heartbeat until the two were indistinguishable. His eyes darted around, but there was no way to make sense of it. The air had thickened so much that it felt like it was pressing against his skin, suffocating him from all sides. His legs buckled beneath him again. He collapsed to the floor, his head spinning. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, alive, watching, waiting. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with the beat of something ancient, something alive that had been waiting for him all along. Andrei clutched his chest, trying to breathe, but the air was gone. There was nothing but the hum, the whispers, the weight of the room pressing down on him. He was drowning in it. "We are you," the voice, his voice, whispered again, this time soft, gentle, as if it were speaking from the deepest recesses of his mind. "You've always been one of us. You just didn't know it." The words echoed in his skull, rattling his thoughts, erasing everything he had ever known. He tried to fight, tried to hold on to something, anything, but the pull was too strong. The shadows were everywhere, inside him, outside him, tangled in his soul. There was no escape. His last thoughts were a blur of confusion and terror, a final scream that never left his mouth. The church, the town, the very air itself, everything had become a part of him. He was the darkness now. He had always been. And there was no turning back. It started with a single envelope. I know, it seems so trivial. An envelope. Just another piece of mail in the pile. But something about it struck me the moment I saw it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle with unease. The handwriting on the front was neat, precise, too neat. And the address was familiar, yet not. It was my own address, but the return address, it was blank. I remember staring at it for what seemed like an eternity. The longer I looked, the more I could feel something shifting in the air around me. Something was off. I opened it with trembling fingers, half expecting to find a bill, maybe a flyer, something utterly unremarkable. But when I slid the paper from the envelope, I froze. The letter was short, written in the same neat handwriting that appeared on the envelope. The words were chilling, direct. By the time you read this, the storm will have begun, and you will not be able to stop it. There was no signature, no explanation, just that. I shook my head, brushing it off as some sort of prank or maybe just a bizarre coincidence. But as the days passed, strange things started to happen. The weather turned. A storm was coming, a big one. And it wasn't like any storm I had ever seen before. The sky darkened with unnerving swiftness, the clouds swirling, turning into something unnatural, as if they were being pulled by some invisible hand. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside my window, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of lightning that weren't in the sky, but in my mind. The letter kept repeating itself in my head, echoing like a voice I couldn't silence. I didn't understand. How could the letter have predicted it? Was it just a coincidence? I tried to convince myself of that, but a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach told me I was wrong. And then, the next day, another letter arrived. I hadn't expected it. How could I? The first one had been so strange, so impossible. But there it was, sitting on my doorstep, the envelope identical to the first. My heart pounded as I reached for it. I was hesitant, almost afraid of what it might say. I opened it quickly. The storm will pass, but something else will follow. Something worse. The words burned themselves into my brain. They felt wrong. I tried to laugh it off. It was just some prank. Just a coincidence. But the feeling wouldn't go away. And the storm, it kept intensifying. Every evening, I would sit in my dimly lit living room, the storm raging outside, feeling as though the walls were closing in on me. The air in the house grew colder with each passing hour, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. I began to hear things too, soft whispers, like voices just beyond the range of hearing, like someone was standing just out of sight, watching me. It wasn't until I saw the third letter that I truly began to fear for my life. But by then, it was already too late. I don't remember when I first started feeling watched. It was like a shadow just outside my peripheral vision. The hairs on the back of my neck standing up for no reason, my stomach tightening at every little noise. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was as though something was waiting, always just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. The third letter arrived, just like the others. There was no return address, no signature, just that same neat handwriting, the words written with the same unnerving precision. You will find what you're looking for in the basement. It is already waiting. I don't know why, but my heart dropped. The basement. I've always hated the basement. It wasn't that there was anything wrong with it, at least, I didn't think there was. But I never liked going down there. It had that musty, damp smell, like it was hiding something that wasn't quite right. But why had the letter mentioned it? Against my better judgment, I found myself walking down the narrow steps to the basement that evening. The house was eerily silent. Too silent. The storm outside had been raging for days now, and the wind made the walls creak like they were groaning under the pressure. The moment I stepped into the basement, I felt it, an unnatural chill that made me shiver despite the heat of the air around me. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the darkness, illuminating only a small portion of the room. The farther I walked, the more I felt like I was being pulled towards something, like a magnet drawing me closer to it. Then I saw it. sitting on the old wooden table in the far corner of the room, something that wasn't there before. A large box. I hadn't put it there. I didn't even remember seeing it the last time I had been down here. My hands were shaking as I approached it, the soft hum of the storm outside making the silence even more unbearable. The box was old, covered in dust, and the top was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of letters. I recognized the handwriting immediately. They were mine. But they weren't. The letters looked like they had been written by someone else, in a handwriting just like the one on the envelopes, the one that had come with the first letter. I felt a surge of panic. My mind screamed to turn and run, but something inside me pushed me forward, telling me to read them. The first letter in the pile was dated several weeks ago, but I had never seen it before. The storm is just the beginning. There are things worse than storms. And they are coming for you. I dropped the letter like it had burned me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely breathe. I wanted to run, to get out of that basement, but I couldn't tear myself away from the letters. Each one, I realized with growing horror, was a prediction. Every letter described something that was happening right now, something that hadn't been in my life before, but now was, like the basement, the feeling of being watched, the storm. I picked up another letter, my hands trembling as I read it. You will see them soon. You will know them by the way they move. I could feel the air growing colder, even colder than it had been. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind rattling the windows above me. I glanced around the room, feeling the unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. That's when I heard it. A soft rustle, like someone shifting their weight, just behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the thick, suffocating darkness. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was there, watching me. And for the first time, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake by reading the letters. I couldn't breathe. The air in the basement had grown thick, like something heavy was pressing against my chest. I turned back to the table, hoping that whatever was behind me was just my imagination. But the letters on the table, my letters, seemed to mock me. Their presence was suffocating, as if they had been waiting for me to open them all along. I tried to calm myself, tried to convince myself that it was just a storm, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the storm. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows above, but there was something in the silence of the basement that was more terrifying than any gust of wind. It was the way the shadows in the corners seemed to move, just out of sight, like they were alive. I couldn't take it any longer. I backed away from the table, toward the stairs, my heart racing. But as my hand touched the railing to climb out, the temperature dropped even more, so much so that I could see my breath fogging in the air. A whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible. But I heard it, just behind me, as if someone was standing right at my shoulder. Don't leave yet. The words, chilling and clear, seemed to vibrate through my bones. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. Nothing. I bolted for the stairs, my feet slipping on the wooden steps as I scrambled upward, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. But as I reached the top, I froze. The basement door, which I had left open behind me, now stood ajar. And I could have sworn I saw someone move in the darkness below. Something tall, thin, and wrong. The shadows were alive, twisting unnaturally around the figure, and I could feel it, its eyes, staring directly at me, even though I couldn't see its face. My legs refused to move. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, the only sound that seemed to matter in that moment. I should have run. I should have screamed. But instead, I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the weight of the unseen presence below. And then, I remembered the letters. The third one. The one that spoke of things moving. Things that weren't supposed to move. I tried to speak, tried to call for help, but my throat felt tight, like the words couldn't escape. All I could do was stare, feeling the presence of that thing in the basement grow stronger, closer. Then, a voice, this time not a whisper, but clear as day, echoed from the darkness below. "You've seen us now, and we will never leave." The words were so final, so cold, they seemed to slice through the air like a blade. I stumbled back, my hand reaching for the door, but when I looked down, the handle was gone. The door frame was empty, as if it had never been there to begin with. I turned, my eyes desperately searching for another way out. But the hallway behind me was now different. The walls were darker, as if the shadows were creeping from the corners and consuming everything around me. That's when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the house. Not my footsteps. Not the storm's howling. But something else. I turned, my breath coming faster now, as I saw the shadow creeping closer, too tall, too thin, its form shifting, as if it wasn't fully real. It was moving toward me, its presence growing stronger, its shape becoming more defined with every passing second. I couldn't move. The footsteps were coming closer, and I could see the figure now, clearer than ever. It had no face, just a dark, shifting mass where one should have been. Its arms were impossibly long, its body twisting in ways that didn't make sense, as if it were bending the very rules of reality. And I knew then that this wasn't just a warning. This wasn't some coincidence. The letters weren't just predictions, they were instructions, guiding me into something far worse than I could have imagined. The storm outside raged on, but inside the house, everything was deathly still. The only sound now was the slow, deliberate creaking of the figure's movements, drawing closer. I was trapped. And as I stood there, frozen in fear, I realized I was never going to escape. I felt it before I heard it. The weight in the air, the strange pressure building up all around me. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was something worse. Something suffocating. My chest was tight, and my vision blurred as the creature, whatever it was, continued to move closer, its long limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. The darkness of its form stretched, like it was devouring the light, and the space around me felt smaller, more cramped. I couldn't breathe. My body trembled as I backed into the wall, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. The door frame was gone. The hallway seemed to stretch into eternity. The windows were black, and the air itself felt thick with malice. It's coming. The thoughts swirled through my mind, and the footsteps grew louder. Closer. The creature was near. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force myself to focus. I had to think this wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. But the coldness on my skin, the darkness pressing against me, told me otherwise. There was no way out. No escape. I was completely alone. Or maybe not. I forced my eyes open, and the first thing I saw was the shadow. It had moved closer, its body now so near that I could feel its presence in every cell of my body. And then, from the empty darkness that surrounded it, something more emerged. More of them. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could sense them, shifting, lurking. Their eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, seemed to glow faintly in the dark, but they had no faces, no identities. They were just shapes. Tall, formless, but unmistakably watching. And then I heard it again. You should have stayed away. The voice was deep, cold, and filled with something far darker than I could comprehend. The ground beneath my feet seemed to quake as I stumbled backward, colliding with the wall once again. The creatures didn't move, they just watched. Their presence was overwhelming, an oppressive force that seemed to choke the very air from my lungs. But then, through the haze of fear, I remembered the letters. The predictions. The warnings. They weren't just telling me what would happen, they were directing me to this moment. You've seen us now, and we will never leave. The words echoed in my head like a twisted mantra that only grew louder, pushing against my sanity. I tried to shut it out, tried to block the sounds, but they were inside me now. The letters were right. They had always been right. I had followed them straight to this nightmare. And now, the creature, the shadow, was right in front of me. I couldn't move. I was trapped in my own home, surrounded by these things that couldn't possibly be real. But they were here. And then, the ground beneath me cracked. Not physically, but mentally. The air shifted again, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something else. Another letter. It was hanging in the air, just in front of me. Unseen by anyone else, but there, hanging in the shadows. The words on the page were blurry at first, but then they cleared. The ink seemed to writhe on the paper, twisting and shifting in a way that was unnatural. The watcher is never far. I shuddered. The creatures moved again, and now I could hear the scraping sound of something long, like nails dragging across the floor, followed by a low growl that vibrated through my bones. And just as I thought I couldn't take any more, one of them stepped forward, its face still hidden in shadow, but there, clear enough that I could feel it watching me. The eyes. The terrible, empty eyes. Now you belong to us. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was at that moment I realized what the letters had been telling me all along. The horrors weren't just predictions, they were real. The Watcher had been with me all this time, in the shadows, in the space just beyond my vision. I had been blind to it. And now, there was no escaping. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My mouth was open, my throat constricting, but no sound, not a single breath, could escape. My lungs were burning, each desperate inhale feeling like it was being ripped from me. I was suffocating, not from lack of air, but from the suffocating pressure of the shadows around me. The creature, they were closer now. So close I could feel the chill of their presence crawling under my skin. The faint glow of their eyes burned like coals in the darkness, their bodies indistinguishable from the night, except for their movements, unnatural, inhuman. "You've been waiting," the voice whispered in my ear. It was so close now I could feel it rattling in my skull. "We've been waiting." I couldn't think. I couldn't understand what was happening, or how. All I knew was that this was real. This wasn't a dream or a hallucination. This was something far worse. I stumbled backwards, my legs shaking, the cold walls of the house pressing against me like they were closing in. There was no way out. I had checked. The windows were sealed tight, the doors locked, bolted, unmovable. Then I remembered. The letters. The words. I had read them over and over in a feverish panic as they revealed each terrifying prediction. And every time I had dismissed them, thinking they were just coincidences. But they weren't. They were warnings. And now, standing in this suffocating, darkened room, surrounded by these creatures, I understood. I had ignored them. I had ignored the warnings. I had ignored the one thing that might have saved me. The last letter, the one that had appeared the night before. The one I had tucked into my coat pocket and forgotten about in the chaos of everything that had come after. I reached for my pocket, my fingers trembling. The letter was still there. With shaking hands, I unfolded it. The ink on the paper danced, still alive, still shifting. The words blurred, but I could make them out. There is only one way to stop the Watcher. End the game. Destroy the sender. I didn't understand it. How could I? Who was the sender? What did it mean to end the game? The sound of footsteps echoed in the hall, coming closer. The shadows grew darker, thicker. The creatures had surrounded me now, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I was trapped. I needed to act. I had no choice. I felt a surge of panic, desperation filling every fiber of my being. I glanced at the letter again. The answer was right there. Destroy the sender. But who? Who was the sender? And then it hit me. The words that had been in the back of my mind all along. The handwriting in the letters, the way they felt so familiar. It was me. I had been writing them all along. But I didn't remember. I couldn't. It made no sense. How could I be the one sending the letters? But it was true. The letters, each one, each prediction, each warning, they had come from my own hand. And the sender had been me. I was the one who had invited this darkness. I was the one who had set the game in motion. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I had created this. And now, there was only one way out. I closed my eyes, trying to force the thoughts into clarity. To end the game, I had to destroy the sender. And I was the sender. The ground shook beneath me, and I realized then what I had to do. I wasn't going to escape. There was no escape. The only way to stop the Watcher, the only way to end this nightmare, was to end myself. With a sudden, sharp motion, I grabbed the letter from my hand and tore it into pieces. And just like that, the air shifted. The creatures froze. Their eyes dimmed. The weight in the room lifted, and the shadows receded. The pressure on my chest was gone, and the suffocating feeling ebbed away. For a moment, everything was silent. And then, just as suddenly, the door opened. It was light. Not the heavy darkness I had been drowning in, but the soft, warm light of the outside world. The creatures were gone. The room was empty. I stood, staring at the door, not sure if I had just dreamed the whole thing. But then, I looked down at my hands, at the pieces of the torn letter scattered on the floor, and I knew it had been real. I had ended the game, but not without cost. The world outside the door felt wrong, hollow, like it wasn't real, like it was just an extension of the nightmare I had just escaped. But one thing was clear, I wasn't safe. Because the letters would never stop. And neither would the Watcher. I had just become the Watcher. It started as an itch at the back of my throat, something subtle, almost imperceptible. I would have ignored it if it hadn't been for the smell. At first, it was faint, almost like the scent of old food left out for too long, something rotten, something decaying. But the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it grew, creeping in at the edges of my consciousness, thickening the air around me until I could barely breathe. I was alone in my apartment. I'd been alone for weeks, ever since things had fallen apart. My friends had stopped coming by, not that I minded. I preferred the silence. But this was different. It was as though the apartment had become alive, not in a good way. There was something wrong in the air, something that didn't belong. I stood in the middle of my living room, staring around at the empty space, trying to locate the source of the stench. The windows were closed, no drafts. I checked the trash, even the fridge, but nothing could explain it. It was as if the smell had seeped from the walls themselves. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just a bad smell, it happens sometimes, I muttered to myself, but it was getting worse. Each day, it intensified, swirling around me like a thick, cloying fog. The smell was suffocating, like death itself had taken root in the corners of my apartment. One night, as I sat at my kitchen table, the smell had grown unbearable. I couldn't focus on anything, on the stale cup of coffee in front of me or the worn-out pages of a book I had been trying to read for hours. The stench was overpowering, turning the air thick and heavy. My breath was shallow. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fogginess that had settled over me. Then I heard it. A rustling sound. It was faint at first, like something small shifting under the floorboards. I froze. There it was again. A low, dragging sound, like something or someone scraping along the wooden floor below me. I told myself it was just the house settling, old buildings did that. But the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing moment. My heart began to race, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel my skin crawling, the hairs on my neck standing up as I waited for whatever it was to make itself known. I moved to the hallway, trying to find the source of the noise. My footsteps echoed in the narrow space. I paused, listening, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, creeping along the wall, darker than the rest of the room. For a moment, it didn't move, almost as though it was waiting for me to notice. I stood still, my breath caught in my throat. It shifted. I stumbled back, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. The air felt colder now, the oppressive stench of rot wrapping itself tighter around me. Was it my mind? Was it just exhaustion, playing tricks on me? But no, the shadow moved again. It was there, real, too real. And the smell, the sickening odor of decay, was growing stronger with every passing second. It was as though the walls themselves were rotting. I backed into the living room, my legs shaking beneath me. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out, but the door was still locked, the windows were shut tight. There was nowhere to go. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself. I'm imagining things, I whispered. I'm just tired. But the smell, the suffocating, rancid smell, was real, and it was only getting worse. The shadow was getting closer. And then it whispered, "You can't escape me." I froze. The voice came from nowhere, a low rasp that slithered under my skin. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, but the screen remained dark. No signal. No help. I was alone. The stench seemed to fill every corner of the room, the walls, the air, suffocating me with the weight of it. I stumbled toward the door, but the moment I reached for the handle, I heard the sound again, the dragging sound, this time behind me, growing louder. It was close. Too close. The shadow was there, right beside me. I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind screaming for escape, but my feet wouldn't move. I felt trapped, like the apartment itself was a prison, no way out, no escape. I turned around, my breath shallow, and saw it. A figure, dark and shifting, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was hunched, distorted, and yet, somehow, too familiar. The features were faint, but I could make out the hollow eyes, the twisted mouth. I could almost see it, but I couldn't see who it was. And then, I remembered. I remembered the things I had buried. The forgotten things, the things I tried to escape, the things that had brought me here. The figure, it was him. The man from my past, the one I tried to forget. The one I had left. And now, he was here. In my apartment. In my mind. The smell of death, of rot, of things better left untouched, it was all him. It was all my past coming back to claim me. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, stuck, as the figure approached, its cold eyes locked on mine. The shadow grew longer, stretching, swallowing the light. "You can't outrun me," it whispered again, its voice a rasping echo in the silent room. The last thing I saw was its mouth opening wide, the darkness inside, as everything around me faded into nothing. I woke up the next morning to the smell of fresh coffee. The apartment was calm, quiet, as though nothing had happened. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The smell was gone, for now. But I could still feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to return. The past never truly leaves. It only waits. I couldn't shake the feeling. The peace that had settled over the apartment felt wrong, too easy, like it was trying to lull me into a false sense of security. But I couldn't deny it. The smell was gone. For now, at least. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe, but the memory of that thing, whatever it was, still clung to me. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than before, and the silence was too heavy, like something was watching, waiting for me to slip up. I tried to go about my day. I made coffee. I ate breakfast. But every sound, the clink of dishes, the hum of the fridge, felt louder, sharper, as though I was being listened to, observed from the other side of the room. I forced myself to ignore it, but it wasn't that easy. I couldn't focus on anything for long. My thoughts kept circling back to the same question: what was that thing? I knew I should leave. I should get out, leave this place behind. But where would I go? And even if I did, would it follow me? Could it? That's when I noticed it again. The faintest trace of something in the air. Not the overwhelming stench of decay, but a hint of it. Just enough to make my skin crawl, to make my throat tighten. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The rustling sound was back, so soft, like a whisper against the walls. But this time, it didn't feel like it was coming from the floor. It was coming from inside the apartment. Behind me. I turned slowly, not sure what I was expecting to see. The room was empty, just the ordinary mess of my life scattered across the floor, dirty laundry, books, papers. But the air felt thicker, denser, like the walls were closing in again. I moved cautiously, each step heavy with dread. My breath felt shallow as I approached the hallway. The scent was stronger now, no longer subtle, but unmistakable. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Just as I was about to open it, I heard it. A voice. Faint, but clear. It's time. The words came from the darkness, a cold whisper that made my skin prickle. My heart raced. Time for what? The door to my bedroom was cracked open, and that's where the voice had come from. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what was inside. I stepped forward, my pulse thumping in my ears, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the smell, the deathly stench, was suffocating now, as if it had gathered all its strength to make itself known. It was coming from the closet. I could feel it, that heaviness in the air, pulling me toward it. I reached for the door. My hand trembled as I gripped the knob and pulled. The closet opened with a groan, revealing darkness. But there, in the back corner, was something I hadn't seen before. A small, wooden box, its surface cracked and worn. The smell was coming from it. I knelt down, my hand shaking as I reached for the box. It was old, ancient, even. The kind of thing you'd find in a forgotten corner of a dusty attic. The moment my fingers touched it, a jolt of cold rushed through me like electricity, and I recoiled, gasping. The voice whispered again, this time clearer. You shouldn't have opened it. I backed away, clutching my chest, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I tried to calm myself. It was just a box. Nothing to be afraid of. But the closer I got to the door, the more the room seemed to close in on me. The air was thick with decay, and the shadows stretched across the walls, twisting, forming shapes that didn't belong. I could feel it, the presence. The thing. It wasn't just in the apartment anymore. It was inside me. It had followed me. It had been waiting. The apartment had become a cage, a tomb, and I was trapped in it. There was no escape. I stood up quickly, backing toward the door, but I couldn't move fast enough. The shadows were closing in on me. I felt them tugging at my limbs, dragging me back. It wasn't just the smell anymore. It was everywhere. The voice was louder now, filling my mind, drowning out all rational thought. You opened the box. Now, you will never leave. The floor beneath me cracked. The walls groaned, as though they were alive, suffocating me with their weight. The shadows reached for me, dark and cold, pulling me into the blackness. I reached for the door, but my hand slipped through the darkness, and I realized there was no way out. The last thing I felt was the cold. The cold that filled every corner of the room. The cold that reached inside me and tore me apart. And then everything went still. The smell was gone, but I could still hear it. The voice. You can't escape the past. I woke up again, but this time it was different. The air was thick, the silence oppressive. I was still in the apartment, but I could feel it, the same heaviness, the same weight pressing down on me. The box was gone. The smell was gone. But I knew, deep down, it was waiting. And this time, it wouldn't let me leave. I was awake, or at least I thought I was. The cold sweat clung to my skin, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps. I sat up, my mind struggling to catch up with reality. The apartment looked exactly the same. The worn carpet, the cluttered coffee table, the faint sunlight creeping in through the blinds. But something had changed. The air felt thicker now, suffocating, like it was pressing in from all sides. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I forced myself to my feet, my legs unsteady as I stumbled toward the window, trying to get some fresh air. But the smell, it lingered. Just a faint trace, but it was there. That rotten, decaying odor that made my stomach twist and my throat burn. It was almost as if it were following me. I opened the window, gasping for the outside air, but instead of relief, all I got was the smell of rain on hot pavement, sharp and overwhelming. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. What had I done? What was this? The box, the voice, the feeling of being trapped, it all felt so real, but it couldn't have been. No one had been in my apartment. No one had touched the box. Yet, I couldn't deny the way the presence lingered, the way it filled every inch of the space. I stumbled toward the kitchen, trying to focus on something, anything that could make me feel grounded. The refrigerator hummed quietly, the faucet dripping in the sink. Small, insignificant noises, but they were the only things I could cling to. But that voice, that whispering voice, it wouldn't stop. It echoed in my mind like a broken record. You open the box. You can't escape. I shut my eyes, squeezing them tight, but the words wouldn't leave. They were burned into my brain like a scar. I opened my eyes again, and for a split second, I saw something move in the reflection of the kitchen window. I turned, heart pounding, expecting to see, what? A person? An intruder? But the room was empty. Yet, the shadows, those dark, shifting shapes, seemed deeper now. They moved like they were alive. I couldn't trust my own eyes. The whole apartment had become a labyrinth of shifting light and dark, a place where nothing made sense. I knew I had to get out. I had to leave. But where could I go? I was already drowning in this madness. The walls felt too close, the silence too loud, the presence too overwhelming. I grabbed my jacket, my hands shaking. I had to leave. I didn't care where. I didn't care if it was day or night. I just had to get away from this place. As I pulled the door open, the smell hit me again, stronger than before. It almost knocked me back, like a physical force. I gagged, stumbling backward. It was coming from the hallway. I had never noticed it before, but now I couldn't ignore it. The smell was stronger here, like it was seeping from the very walls. Like it was pulling me, dragging me back into the apartment. The walls were closing in, and I could feel it, the thing, waiting, watching. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the longer I stayed, the harder it became to tell the difference. Was I losing my mind? Or was this something more? I backed away from the door, my hands pressing against the cool surface of the wall as if it might hold me together. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and empty, just like the apartment. But the further I moved, the heavier the air became. The smell, the whispers, the shadows, they were everywhere now. I needed to leave. I had to leave. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to let me go. I didn't know what to do. The apartment was no longer just a place where I lived. It had become something else, something that was alive, suffocating me, pressing out all sides. I had tried to leave, but now I was trapped. The hallway was endless, stretching further than I remembered, the floor creaking under my feet like it was groaning in protest. I could hear it again, the faint, steady whispering. But it wasn't just in my head anymore. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the shadows that seemed to thicken with every step I took. You shouldn't have opened it. It's too late. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It sounded like my own thoughts, twisted and wrong. A reflection of the fear that gnawed at me, but with an edge, something darker. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but the words were too clear, too real. I looked down at my hands, noticing for the first time how pale they had become, how they trembled uncontrollably. My fingers ached, as if they were clenching something, holding onto something that didn't exist. But I had opened the box, hadn't I? I had done it, and now I heard a soft, wet sound. It came from the walls. I froze. I shouldn't have heard it. It was impossible, a trick of the mind, but I knew better. That sound, it was coming closer. I turned, my eyes darting across the room, desperately searching for the source. The shadows shifted again, moving in ways that couldn't be natural. There was something in them, something watching. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. My breath was shallow, every inhale felt like I was suffocating on that damn smell. But I couldn't look away. I was rooted to the spot, as if some force had latched onto me, unwilling to let me escape. The smell grew stronger, more intense. Rotting flesh, decay, death. I gagged, pressing a sleeve to my nose, but it didn't help. It suffocated me, filled my lungs, my mind, until it was all I could think about. And then, for just a split second, I saw it. A figure. It was barely there, just a silhouette in the corner of my eye, but I felt its presence. It was watching me, waiting. I spun around, but nothing was there. Only the shadows. Only the walls closing in on me. I stumbled forward, my legs unsteady, as if I were walking on a ship caught in a storm. The apartment was no longer familiar. The furniture, the walls, the floor, everything felt wrong, disorienting, like it had shifted in the time I had been standing there, caught in the madness. The hallway was now longer. The door to the bathroom, which had once been just a few steps away, now felt miles away. The kitchen seemed farther down the hall, out of reach, as if the space itself was stretching and warping. You opened the box, the voice whispered again, so close it made my skin crawl. You can't undo it. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out. I had to escape. I reached the front door, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the handle. My breath came in short bursts, like I couldn't get enough air, like it was being sucked from me. And still, that smell. It lingered, suffocating, filling every inch of space around me. The door wouldn't open. I twisted the handle again, harder this time, but it was stuck. It wouldn't budge. I pulled and yanked, panic rising in my chest. No, no, no. The door was supposed to open. I had to leave. I had to get away from this nightmare. Then I heard it again, the soft, squelching noise. This time, it wasn't in the walls. It was right behind me. I turned quickly, but I saw nothing. Just shadows. I had to get out. But the apartment was closing in, and no matter how hard I pulled, the door remained locked. The shadows around me grew darker, their shapes more defined now. They were moving, twisting, changing. And then, I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness. At first, it was just a shadow, but it grew more defined. It was tall, hunched, its limbs too long, too thin. Its face was obscured, a dark void where its features should have been. But I could feel its eyes. I could feel them staring at me. It reached out a hand, its fingers stretched long and crooked, and as it moved closer, the air grew colder, the smell more unbearable. I backed up, unable to take my eyes off of it. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body was frozen. "You shouldn't have opened it," the voice repeated, this time louder, more forceful. "Now you'll never leave." The figure lunged, and everything went black. I woke up gasping for air, my heart thundering in my chest. It took me a moment to realize I wasn't dead, that I hadn't been consumed by whatever that thing was. But I felt different. As if the air itself had changed, thickened, carrying with it a sense of dread that wouldn't let go. I was back in the apartment. The familiar surroundings, the warm couch, the peeling wallpaper, all of it was the same, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a prison. The smell was gone for the moment, but I knew better than to believe it was over. It would return. It always did. I sat up slowly, my body aching as though I'd been dragged through the dirt. My fingers pressed into the floor, trying to steady myself. The echoes of that dark figure were still there, lingering in the back of my mind. The cold, the smell, the eyes. I could still feel them. A knock at the door. I froze. Who would come now? After everything, after the terror I'd just experienced? No one. No one could be out there. I had to be imagining it. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. I stood up shakily, almost tripping over myself as I made my way to the door. My pulse was racing, the blood pounding in my ears. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see nothing, but there was someone there. A man, standing perfectly still in the hallway. He was dressed in an old coat, a fedora tipped down over his face, so I couldn't make out his features. But there was something about him, something unsettling, like he didn't belong. I didn't know who he was, but in that moment, I felt the pull of something darker. He was connected to all of this. Connected to the smell, to the shadow, to the things that I couldn't explain. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. Should I open it? Should I ignore him? I couldn't stay locked in here forever. But I also couldn't face whatever this was. The knock came again. Faster, more urgent. I tried to steady my breathing. Maybe he was just a delivery man. Maybe someone who didn't know about the horrors of this place. Maybe I was losing my mind. But then I heard it again. You can't escape. The voice, the one that had haunted my thoughts, now came from behind the door. It was his voice, deep and distorted, as though it was being whispered through the cracks in the wood. I stumbled back, my heart skipping a beat. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to face whatever was on the other side. But then, a soft click. The door handle turned. I hadn't touched it. I watched in horror as the door creaked open just a sliver. And through that sliver, I saw him. His eyes, empty and black, staring straight into mine. He wasn't just standing there. He was inside. I backed up, instinctively reaching for the nearest thing, a chair, a lamp, anything to defend myself, but there was nothing. The door opened wider, and the smell returned. The putrid stench, the smell of death. It was stronger than ever. It filled the room, saturated the air, made it impossible to breathe. My stomach lurched. I choked back bile. The man stepped forward. He didn't speak, didn't move in any normal way. He floated toward me, his feet never touching the ground. And in his wake, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were marks on the walls, faint at first, then growing darker, more defined. Shapes. Symbols. They were drawn with something wet, something that smelled of decay. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared at him, at the way he moved, at the terrible certainty that whatever he was not human. His mouth parted, but no sound came out. Instead, I felt his words in my mind, cold and insistent. It's already inside. I gasped, stepping back, my legs shaking with fear. I was cornered. I couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. I was trapped. And as his hand reached out, I realized he wasn't just here. The thing that had been following me, the thing I had tried to escape, was now in my very bones. The darkness inside me was alive. And it was only just beginning. I don't remember much of what happened after that. My mind was a blur, clouded with panic and confusion. I remember feeling his hand, cold, impossibly cold, brush against my arm. And then everything spun. I woke up hours later, or maybe days. It was hard to tell. The apartment was silent. The oppressive weight of the air had lifted slightly, but the smell, it lingered, faint but persistent, just beneath the surface. I was alone. Or so I thought. I forced myself to sit up, my body still weak and trembling. Every part of me screamed to run, to get out of there, but where would I go? It wasn't safe anymore. No matter how far I ran, it would follow. It had already marked me. The walls seemed different now. The symbols from before, they were clearer, more pronounced. They crept along the corners of the room, winding like serpents. I could almost feel them watching me, as though they had life of their own. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind. I had to think. I had to figure out how to stop it. The door. I hadn't closed it all the way when that thing was here. It was ajar now, just a sliver of darkness waiting beyond. The hallway looked different too. The usual soft hum of the building, the muffled voices from neighbors, everything was gone. It was just silent. Hollow. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady as I moved toward the door. I couldn't keep hiding. I had to confront it, face whatever was behind that door. But I was terrified. Every step felt like it was pulling me closer to something I didn't want to know. I reached out, my hand trembling as I gripped the cold metal handle. The door didn't budge at first. It was as if something was holding it shut, keeping me from going any further. But with a hard twist, I forced it open. The hallway was empty. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined the whole thing, the man, the symbols, the overwhelming fear. Maybe I was just losing my mind. But then I saw it. A small, black feather. It lay on the floor just outside my door, untouched by time, untouched by the silence that had swallowed everything. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers brushing the delicate strands. The moment I touched it, I felt a cold shiver run through me. The smell, stronger now, slammed into me, overwhelming my senses. It was coming from behind me. I turned around. It was there, standing at the far end of the hallway. The man, if that's even what he was waiting. His posture was unnaturally still, his head tilted at a strange angle. His eyes were locked onto mine, dark and unblinking. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched. My heart raced. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I couldn't move. The hallway seemed to stretch, pulling me toward him, drawing me in. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing heavier with each breath. The feather crumbled in my hand. And then I heard it, a whisper. "It's too late." The voice echoed in my mind, louder than any sound I had ever heard. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking to me, urging me to surrender, to accept what was coming. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I tried to run. I didn't care where, I just needed to escape. I pushed past the man, or whatever he was, but as I reached the end of the hallway, I saw it. The door to the stairwell, it wasn't there anymore. It was gone. In its place stood a dark, endless void, stretching into nothingness. There was no exit. No escape. And then I heard it, the soft, distant sound of footsteps behind me. Slow. Deliberate. I turned around. The man was closer now. Much closer. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was his smile. And then there was nothing. I had no idea what drew me to the city at first. The question lingered in my mind as I wandered through the empty streets. Why am I here? I didn't recognize anything, but something about it felt strangely familiar. Maybe it was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, it was a dead, suffocating quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums as though the world had simply stopped. The buildings towered above me, their dark windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. The cobblestones beneath my feet felt smooth, cold, and lifeless. There was no movement, no voices, no sounds at all. Not even the usual hum of distant traffic, the rustling of leaves in the wind, or the chatter of people walking by. Just nothing. I tried to speak. No sound escaped my mouth. My throat tightened, and a wave of unease washed over me. Why couldn't I make a sound? I opened my mouth again, but nothing. Not even the faintest whisper. A strange sensation crawled down my spine. As I walked deeper into the city, the unease grew. I could feel eyes on me. Or maybe it was just my imagination. The whole place felt off. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, like a weight I couldn't shake. There was a faint smell in the air, something stale, like old paper or forgotten memories. It made my head spin. I quickened my pace, but the silence was suffocating. The street seemed to stretch on endlessly, leading nowhere. Every corner I turned looked the same. I was stuck in a loop, a maze with no way out. And then I noticed it. A shadow, barely noticeable at first, flitted across a window above me. I stopped. My heart raced. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like something, or someone, had moved behind that glass. Did anyone see that? I whispered, but the words died before they left my lips. I couldn't hear myself. The silence was oppressive, like the world itself had been erased. I turned the corner, my eyes scanning the empty street. But nothing moved. No one. Not a sound. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick, but even that seemed unnatural in a place so still. The air felt heavy. It pressed against my chest. A strange thought crossed my mind. Am I the only one here? But that didn't make sense, right? There had to be others. There had to be someone. But where were they? The tension in my body grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. It was like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I turned a corner, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The street ahead seemed darker. The buildings loomed over me like giants watching my every move. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like a soft scrape against the ground. I froze. My heart pounded. The sound grew louder, closer. But where was it coming from? I looked around frantically, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, but there was nothing. Just the empty street, the empty windows, the empty silence. Hello? I called out, but the word hung in the air, unspoken. I heard the scrape again, and this time it was followed by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was too faint to understand, but I could feel it. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. The silence was too heavy, too thick. I felt trapped, unable to escape the feeling that something was closing in around me. But what was it? I couldn't be sure. My mind raced, trying to rationalize everything, but all I had was that creeping sense of dread that wouldn't let go. Then, as I stood there, frozen in place, the whispering grew louder. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing. The street was still empty, still silent. But I could feel it now, the presence, the sensation of being watched. My breath hitched in my throat. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a quiet city. This wasn't just an empty street. The city itself was alive. And it was watching me. I couldn't breathe. The air seemed to thicken around me, pressing against my chest, squeezing the life out of me. My mind raced in frantic circles, trying to find a reason, any reason, for the feeling creeping up my spine. But there was none. Only that deep, primal fear gnawing at my insides. The whispering continued, though now it was more distinct. A low murmur, like a voice just on the edge of hearing, luring me into something I didn't want to understand. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced over my shoulder again, nothing. No one. Just the silent buildings, their blackened windows staring at me like hollow eyes. I shook my head, forcing myself to move. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But where would I go? The streets seemed to stretch on forever. No matter which direction I walked, the feeling of being followed never left. It was as if the very air around me was alive, wrapping itself around my skin, suffocating me with its quiet presence. I was being pulled deeper into the city, unable to break free. A sudden gust of wind stirred the stale air, making the leaves rustle, but even that sound felt wrong, too soft, too faint. I couldn't trust my own senses. My footsteps echoed loudly, as though my every move was being amplified, a constant reminder that I was alone. Or was I? The whispering began again, more forceful now, and I stopped dead in my tracks. It was as if it was coming from all directions at once. My hands shook, and I pressed my palms against my ears, trying to block it out, but the voices only grew clearer, like a chant, a rhythmic murmur that made my blood run cold. You are not alone. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, scanning the darkened street for any sign of movement. Nothing. The silence swallowed the words, leaving only the hollow echo of my own panic. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. I needed to find someone. I needed to know that there was another person in this place. Anyone. The emptiness was driving me mad. The further I walked, the more the streets seemed to shift. I could swear that the buildings around me were closing in, their jagged edges stretching and distorting, warping into shapes I couldn't understand. My eyes darted from one side to the other, but everything looked the same. The same lifeless facades, the same empty windows. But something was changing. It wasn't just the city's appearance. It was something inside me, something I couldn't ignore. A sense of dread, deeper than before, a feeling that I was no longer in control of my own thoughts. The boundaries between reality and something else were beginning to blur. A sound, no, not a sound, suddenly pierced the stillness. It wasn't a voice, but a scraping, slow and deliberate. A heavy, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground, and it was getting closer. My heartbeat quickened. I froze again, my entire body tensing. This time, it wasn't my imagination. It was real. The scraping stopped. The silence was unbearable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was causing the sound was standing right behind me, waiting for me to turn around. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned. There, just a few steps away, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, its features indistinct, lost in the shadows. The air around it felt wrong. The space itself seemed to warp and twist, bending as if the world were being reshaped by its presence. Its head tilted, an unnatural movement that made my stomach churn. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure didn't move. It simply watched me, its presence suffocating. Then, without warning, it began to step forward. The scraping sound followed it, dragging across the cobblestones like nails on a chalkboard. My heart raced in my chest, thundering in my ears, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't look away from those dark, shifting eyes, or what I thought were eyes. And then it whispered, "Come closer." My skin crawled, every nerve screaming for me to move, to run, but I stood rooted to the spot, unable to break free from the unnatural pull. The voice was soft, but it filled my mind completely, like it was inside my head. It wasn't asking. It wasn't begging. It was commanding. I opened my mouth to speak, to call for help, but no sound came. I was mute again, trapped in the endless silence. The figure took another step, and another, until it was only a few feet from me. I could feel its presence more than I could see it now, like the air around it had thickened, become heavier, pressing down on me. The space between us seemed to distort, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving within the darkness that clung to its form. A face, twisted and half-formed, like something not quite human. It leaned in close, its breath cold against my skin, and for the first time since I had entered the city, I felt truly afraid. But before I could react, the figure stepped back, vanishing into the shadows. And just like that, the scraping stopped. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. I stood frozen, my mind racing, heart pounding. What had just happened? What was that thing? Was it real? Or had I imagined it? The whispers were gone, but the dread remained, crawling through my veins, settling deep inside me. And once again, I was left with nothing but the silence, the empty streets, and the growing certainty that I was being watched. I couldn't move. My body felt like it had turned to stone, frozen in place by the lingering presence of that thing. The silence around me was deafening, so much so that I could hear my own shallow breathing, ragged and broken. It was all I could hear, nothing else. I took a hesitant step backward, my feet scraping across the cold stone. My mind was scrambling, trying to process what had just happened, but it couldn't. It was too much. Too unreal. I had seen something. No, felt something. But I still couldn't make sense of it. The figure, it had been real, hadn't it? I couldn't convince myself it wasn't. My heart was still pounding, my thoughts spinning. I had to get out of here. I had to leave this cursed city, but where could I go? Every street was the same, every corner, every shadow. I was trapped. I turned around quickly, desperate to find some sort of exit, but the street behind me was just as empty as the one I had just walked. The same lifeless, towering buildings, their windows reflecting nothing but an endless, black void. The wind picked up again, carrying with it that stale, decaying smell. It was the same scent I had noticed when I first arrived, but now it felt heavier, more pungent, like the city itself was rotting from the inside out. My stomach churned, and I gagged, trying to block it out. I reached out, grasping a nearby lamp post to steady myself. It felt cold beneath my fingers, as though it had been standing there for centuries, untouched, unmoved by time. I looked up at the sky, hoping for some sign, some clue that I wasn't alone. But there was nothing. No birds, no clouds. Just an empty expanse of gray, as if even the sky itself had been drained of life. A movement caught my eye. At the far end of the street, something shifted in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze again, staring at the darkened figure that had appeared so suddenly. It was watching me. I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't make out its features. It wasn't the same as before. This one was different, more distant. Yet, I knew it was waiting for me. I couldn't tell whether it was a person or something else. The shape was distorted, almost like it was flickering in and out of existence, a blur between reality and something else, something more sinister. My breath hitched as it started to move toward me. Slowly, deliberately. Each step felt like a beat of my own heart, pulling me closer to whatever this thing was. And then, a sound. A faint creak echoed through the stillness, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, dragging, like someone, or something, was pulling itself along the ground. It wasn't just a single sound. It was a pattern. And it was coming closer. My stomach lurched. I tried to force myself to move, to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The closer it got, the more suffocating the air became. I finally broke free, turning and sprinting down the street without thinking. My breath came in ragged gasps, and every step I took felt like I was running through thick mud. But no matter how fast I ran, the silence, the shadows, they followed me. It was as if the city itself was shifting, bending to trap me. The buildings around me began to look different now, wrong. The walls were beginning to tilt, as if they were leaning in closer, encroaching on my space. My skin crawled, and I could hear the low hum of something vibrating, growing louder, louder with each passing moment. It wasn't a sound I could describe, but it was inside my head, crawling beneath my skin. I turned another corner, gasping for air, but there it was again, the shadow. It stood at the end of the street, still and silent. And this time, there was no mistaking it. The figure was moving toward me again. But this time, I noticed something new. Its movements weren't natural. They were jerky, distorted, like the figure didn't belong to this world at all. It seemed to glitch, flickering and shifting with each step, becoming more and more distorted until it was less a person and more a collection of dark shapes that I could barely comprehend. It was getting closer. My heart raced as I turned to run again, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My breath came in short bursts, and for the first time, I truly felt how isolated I was. No one could hear me. No one was coming to help. I was completely alone, trapped in a city that didn't care about me, a city that was trying to swallow me whole. I reached for the nearest door, praying that it would open. But it didn't. It was locked. Every door I tried was locked. The windows shuttered, as if the city itself was closing its eyes, refusing to look at me. The scraping noise was back, louder now, and closer. I could feel the presence of the figure behind me, its weight pressing down on me, suffocating me with its unrelenting approach. "Come closer." The words whispered in my ears again, cold and familiar, a voice that wasn't a voice. It was everywhere, inside my mind, a terrible command that echoed through my thoughts. I felt it, whatever it was in my head now, in my thoughts, controlling my every movement. I spun around, my eyes wide, and that's when I saw it. The thing was right there. The shape flickered again, its face shifting into something barely recognizable, twisted and wrong. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, extending far beyond what any human body could do. I screamed. I finally screamed, but no sound came out. There was only that unbearable silence. I was going to die here. Alone. My heart hammered in my chest, my body frozen in terror. The figure's twisted, flickering form stood before me, its eyes, or what I thought were eyes, staring right through me, as if it could see into my very soul. I tried to scream again, to fight, but the words caught in my throat. The silence swallowed me whole. For a moment, everything stood still. The scraping sound stopped. The flickering stopped. The air was thick with an unnatural pressure, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, it moved. The figure lunged forward with a speed that was unnatural, its body warping in ways I couldn't comprehend. Its limbs stretched unnervingly long, and with a grotesque crack, it reached for me, its fingers like blackened tendrils. I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over the cobblestones, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I felt its cold breath on my skin as it grabbed hold of my arm, its fingers tightening around my wrist with a strength that made my bones ache. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the world itself was distorting, bending under the weight of whatever this thing was. My vision blurred, my mind spinning in confusion and fear. What does it want? The thought flashed through my head, but it was drowned out by the intense, otherworldly sensation that seemed to consume my mind. The creature wasn't just touching me, it was inside me. Its presence, its power, was wrapping around my thoughts, choking me, drowning me in its dark grip. I felt something shift within me, as though a door was being pushed open, and I could feel something else, something hidden, starting to stir. My chest tightened, my breathing quickened. It wasn't just the creature. There was something else, something deep inside me, something I had buried long ago. I shook my head, trying to focus, trying to break free, but the figure's grip only tightened. It dragged me toward it, pulling me into the shadows where I couldn't see anything but the shifting darkness. I was losing myself. Losing everything. I was slipping. I could hear it now, clearer than before, the whispering. But it wasn't just the figure whispering. It was everywhere. In my ears, in my mind. It was the city itself, speaking to me in a voice that I couldn't escape. You are one of us. The words reverberated through me like a pulse, a heavy thudding in my skull. My vision blurred again, and I thought I saw faces in the darkness. No, not faces. Shadows of faces. They twisted and distorted, flickering like the figure, like a terrible dream that was just out of reach. I tried to pull away, to fight, but the creature's grip was unyielding. It was pulling me towards something, a doorway, a passage I hadn't noticed before. It was narrow, dark, and seemed to swallow everything around it, leaving only emptiness in its wake. I felt my body being dragged forward, but a part of me resisted. I fought against the pull, against the compulsion to follow it into the void. Something inside me screamed to break free, to hold onto the last shreds of my sanity. But the darkness was overpowering. I stepped into the doorway. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world shifted again. It was as though the city itself had been around me, like the ground beneath my feet was no longer solid, like I was floating, drifting through a void. The silence was now deafening. My thoughts were being swallowed by the same blackness that surrounded me. The figure was no longer touching me. It had retreated, fading into the shadows, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond my vision. The walls of the narrow space pressed in on me, and the deeper I went, the colder it became. The air was thick with the same suffocating pressure, but now there was something else. Something worse. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker here and there. But as I moved deeper into the space, the shadows grew larger, more defined. And then, they began to take shape. Faces. Eyes. Teeth. Mouths that whispered my name. My legs felt weak, and I had to brace myself against the cold, stone walls to stay standing. I tried to scream again, but still no sound came out. I was trapped in a void of silence, with only the whispers and the shadows to keep me company. Was this the end? The thought crashed through my mind, but it was quickly drowned out by the rising cacophony of whispers. The shadows were closing in, moving faster now. I couldn't escape them. They were everywhere, stretching across the walls, creeping toward me with every step I took. The cold grew unbearable. My skin was numb, my thoughts slipping further away with every passing second. I had to find a way out. There had to be a way out. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. I froze. A cold dread seeped into my bones. And then I heard it. A sound. A single, sharp noise that shattered the silence like glass. It was a crack. A crack that split the air. A crack that split reality itself. I turned to face the source, but before I could react, the shadows lunged forward, swallowing me whole. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure standing in the doorway, watching me, its hollow eyes gleaming with that same twisted hunger. And then, nothing. I woke up to darkness. Not the kind of darkness that blankets the world at night, but a suffocating, thick blackness that seemed to crawl beneath my skin. It was all-consuming. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. There was no sound, no light, no sensation other than the weight of the silence pressing down on me from all sides. I blinked, my eyelids heavy, as if I had been asleep for centuries. When I finally managed to push through the haze, I felt the cold stone beneath my fingers. My body ached, bruised, and exhausted, as if I had been dragged across sharp edges through endless nothingness. I tried to move, but my limbs felt sluggish, uncooperative, as if they belonged to someone else. I sat up slowly, the air around me thick and stale, carrying the same suffocating smell I had encountered before. The same decay. But something was different. The air wasn't just heavy, it felt wrong, like something was twisting it, bending it. I couldn't breathe properly, and the panic began to rise again in my chest. The silence felt unnatural now, like the very world around me had been frozen in place. Then, I heard it. A faint scraping noise. Soft at first, like the sound of nails dragging across a stone surface. But it was growing louder. I could feel it reverberating through the ground, through my bones. It was the same sound I had heard before in the streets, only this time it was much closer. Closer than it had ever been. My heart raced. I tried to move, to get to my feet, but my body refused to obey. I could feel something closing in on me, an invisible presence that was suffocating and consuming me whole. My pulse pounded in my ears. It was coming. I could feel it. I forced my legs to stand, shaking with the effort, my body trembling from the sheer terror of what was near. My eyes scanned the pitch-black room around me, but I couldn't make out any shapes, any figures. It was as if I was alone in a void. And yet, I knew I wasn't. Another sound. This time, it wasn't the scraping of nails. It was heavier. A thud, like something large and cumbersome moving through the space. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I instinctively backed up, feeling the cold stone wall against my back. The thud grew louder, closer. The room was closing in on me. I could feel the walls pressing in, their jagged edges cutting into my skin. The air around me shifted, thickening. The shadows seemed to grow, stretching out from the corners and twisting toward me, wrapping themselves around my limbs. It's here. The thought was clear and undeniable. The presence had finally caught up to me. I tried to breathe, but the air was too thick, too heavy. I couldn't catch my breath. The shadows were moving faster now, circling me like a predator closing in on its prey. My pulse quickened, and I could hear the rasp of my own breath in the oppressive silence. I turned, desperate to escape, but there was no door. No windows. No exit. Just the black walls, the suffocating dark, and that unrelenting, oppressive thing that was coming for me. Then, a flicker of light. It was brief, just a moment, but it was enough to make my heart stop. In the brief flash, I saw a figure. A shadowy, distorted figure that seemed to shift between being human and something else entirely. Its face was a blur, its shape flickering like a broken light bulb. It was watching me. I staggered backward, my hands scrambling for anything to hold onto, but there was nothing. The walls were slick with cold moisture, offering no relief. The air was oppressive, suffocating. The whispers started again. They weren't just whispers now, they were voices, low and guttural, repeating words I couldn't understand, a language that twisted my mind. You are ours. I couldn't tell if the voice came from the figure or if it was inside my head, but the meaning of it was clear. It wasn't a question. It was a command. A pulse of fear surged through me. I had to get away. I had to do something. My body was trembling, frozen with terror, but I forced myself to move. Every step was a struggle, my feet dragging across the stone floor as I stumbled forward in search of an exit that didn't exist. The figure was moving too. Slowly, deliberately, its form shifting and warping with every step it took. It was getting closer. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. I could feel it breathing, its presence suffocating, heavy, like it was all around me, closing in from all sides. I reached out again, blindly, and my hand collided with something. A cold, metallic surface. I could barely make out the outline of a door. It was a sliver of hope, a glimmer of escape, but as my hand gripped the cold handle, I hesitated. What if it was a trap? What if the city wanted me to open it? I shook my head, the thought racing through my mind, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. I twisted the handle, the metal groaning in protest. It was unlocked. I swung the door open. A burst of cold air hit me, sharp and biting, as I stepped through. The dark room gave way to an even darker corridor. I didn't stop to question where it led, I just ran. The shadows didn't follow me, not immediately. But I could feel them. They were still there, lurking, watching, waiting for me to slip. But I couldn't stop now. I pushed forward, deeper into the cold, into the unknown, knowing that the figure was still out there, somewhere. The city wasn't done with me yet. It wouldn't let me go so easily. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I ever would leave. I never believed in ghosts. Not once in my life. But that was before I discovered what happens when the right device is turned on. It started small, at first. A flicker on my computer screen, and on distortion in the video. I was working late on an old laptop I'd found in the attic, a relic from the past. I hadn't used it in years. It was glitchy, the screen would freeze at odd intervals, but I was used to it. It was an old machine, nothing special. But one night, as I was scrolling through files, the distortion on the screen became more than just a flicker. It started as static, just a burst of noise, like radio interference, but then I heard a voice. A whisper, barely audible. My first thought was that it was coming from the speakers, but no sound should have been coming out. The laptop was muted. "Hello?" I muttered under my breath. There was a slight pause, and then the whisper grew clearer. "Don't trust it." I froze. I was alone. I reached over, hesitating for a moment, and turned off the laptop. The screen went black. The voice stopped. But the unsettling feeling lingered. I couldn't shake the thought of it. The voice had been real, hadn't it? A strange, distorted voice coming from a piece of equipment that was malfunctioning. That night, I tried to convince myself that it was just a glitch. Nothing more. But deep down, I knew it was something else. The next evening, the voices returned. I was sitting on the couch, watching an old TV show. I had the volume low, just enough to fill the silence. I didn't notice at first, but then it became too hard to ignore. A low At first, it sounded like the static between channels. But it grew louder, more defined. And then I saw it. In the corner of the screen, just barely noticeable, was the outline of a figure. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. A shadowy figure standing still, as though watching me. I squinted, rubbing my eyes. The figure didn't move, but I felt a presence there. I turned up the volume, desperate to hear something, anything, that would drown out the feeling of being watched. The figure didn't disappear. In fact, it began to shift, slowly, its outline becoming more distinct. It was a person, but the features were vague. They didn't make sense. Their face flickered between moments of clarity and distortion, like a broken signal. Then, the voice came again. "Help me." I jumped, my heart racing. The voice was louder this time, more insistent. "Who are you?" I found myself asking, even though I knew it was futile. The figure remained motionless, like a phantom on the screen, fading in and out of existence. "Help me," it repeated, the words becoming more frantic, more desperate. I couldn't look away. My body felt paralyzed, as if the screen had somehow reached out and grabbed hold of me. I tried to reach for the remote to turn it off, but my hand trembled, unable to move fast enough. The image on the screen grew clearer, and in that moment, I could see it, really see it. The figure was a woman, her face distorted with pain, her mouth opening and closing but not forming words. Her eyes were wide with terror, as though she had seen something I couldn't. And then the screen went black. I sat there, frozen. My mind was reeling, my body numb with fear. I stood up, but my legs felt unsteady beneath me. I grabbed the remote, but when I turned the TV back on, everything was normal. The show resumed, the screen was clear, and there were no voices, no figures. Nothing unusual. I told myself it was all in my head. The static, the distortion, it was just a glitch. Maybe the TV was breaking down. I tried to focus, to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at my mind. But as the days passed, the phenomenon only grew worse. It wasn't just the TV. It was the devices in my home. Every time I turned one on, there was a strange, inexplicable distortion. At first, it was just whispers, low murmurs that I couldn't quite understand. But then, the figures began to appear more frequently. They were always the same, pale, indistinct shapes of people, flickering in and out of view. And every time they appeared, they seemed to be trying to tell me something, but their voices were always drowned out by the static, the hum of the electronics. One evening, I tried something different. I set up my phone, facing me, recording. I wanted to capture whatever was happening, to prove to myself that it wasn't just my imagination. I turned the phone's camera on, placing it on the table in front of me. The screen flickered to life. And then I saw her. The woman. She was standing right in front of me, her face pale, her eyes wide, filled with fear. But this time, she was closer than she had ever been. I could see her more clearly now. Her lips moved, but the sound was lost beneath the static. "Help me, please," she whispered. I reached out to touch the screen, but as I did, her face twisted. The image contorted, becoming something grotesque, something unnatural. The static grew louder, the hum turning into a screeching noise that filled the room. My head began to throb, and the lights flickered. I stumbled back, knocking over the phone in my haste to escape. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around me. The screen remained on, the distorted figure still there, its image warping and stretching. The whispers came again, now clear as day, echoing in my ears. "You're not alone. You're not alone." I was trapped. The devices in my home had become portals, connecting me to something beyond my understanding. Something that wanted to reach out, to speak, to pull me into their world. I didn't know how to escape it. Was it all in my mind? Was this just a manifestation of my fear, my isolation? Or had I opened a door to something far worse? I couldn't say. All I knew was that the voices had found me, and they weren't going away. The following day, I tried to go about my routine, convinced that the previous night was some kind of bad dream, a fevered hallucination caused by stress or exhaustion. I had been under a lot of pressure lately, working long hours on my projects. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I didn't dare touch any of the devices again. No TV, no computer, not even my phone. I kept them all turned off, stacked away in a drawer as if keeping them out of sight could somehow erase the terror they had unleashed. But it didn't work. The silence in my apartment was deafening. The hum of the world outside was muted. It felt as if the whole building, the whole city, was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't understand. At night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, but I couldn't sleep. The thought of turning the devices back on, the thought of hearing those voices again, terrified me, but it also beckoned me. They had tried to tell me something. Help me. But who were they? And why did they seem so desperate? The next evening, I found myself standing in front of my computer. I hadn't planned on doing it. It wasn't a conscious decision, but my hand reached for the mouse before I could stop it. My heart raced as I clicked the power button. The screen flickered. For a moment, I thought I'd made a mistake, that it was just another glitch. But then it happened again. A voice. Quiet at first, but then louder, clearer. Please. I gasped and quickly reached to turn off the computer, but the voice persisted, rising in volume, no longer a whisper but a cry. Please, don't leave me. I froze. The voice wasn't coming from the speakers. It wasn't even coming from the computer. It was coming from behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there. The room was empty. The sound of the voice, though, was unmistakable. It was clear as day, coming from the very air around me. I ran to the door, grabbed the handle, and stopped. The hallway outside was just as empty. But something was wrong. The silence was oppressive, like a blanket, smothering the usual sounds of the building. Then I saw it. The figure, standing in the darkened hallway outside my door. It was a man this time. He was tall, but his features were blurred, like a face out of focus. His body was completely still, but his eyes were wide open, fixed directly on me. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Help me. The voice whispered again, only this time it wasn't the man's voice. It was the woman's. I stepped back, bumping into the desk. The screen on my computer turned on by itself, the static flickering violently as the image warped again. It was her again. The woman. Her face appeared on the screen, distorted and blurry. But this time, she was no longer alone. The man from the hallway was there too, standing behind her. His face flickered in and out, just like hers. They were both reaching for me, silently pleading. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out of that apartment, away from whatever this was. My feet pounded against the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway stretched out before me, but no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling of eyes watching me from every corner. I burst into the stairwell and climbed down the steps as fast as I could, my pulse hammering in my ears. It wasn't until I reached the street that I stopped, gasping for air, staring at the pavement beneath me. The night was cold, and the city was quiet, too quiet. The hum of the world was gone. It was as if everything had been swallowed by the same silence that had filled my apartment. I pulled out my phone, trembling. I had to make sense of what was happening. I had to talk to someone, anyone. But as I opened the messaging app, I froze again. The screen was static, just like the devices in my apartment. Please, help me. The message appeared, a simple sentence, but the voice was there too. Clear, like it was being spoken into my ear. I looked around. No one was nearby. The street was empty. Yet the voice was everywhere. Please, don't leave me. This time, the voice didn't belong to the woman or the man. It sounded like me. It was me, but not me. And then, the screen on my phone began to crack. I watched in horror as the cracks spread out across the glass, forming strange patterns that seemed to move, shifting like the faces I had seen. The phone slipped from my fingers, hitting the ground with a loud crack. The static intensified. It wasn't just the phone anymore. It was everything. The city, the air, the streets, the world itself was becoming warped, distorted. I had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear: I wasn't alone anymore. And whatever these voices were, they were here to stay. I couldn't breathe. Every step I took felt heavier, like I was sinking into the ground. The city around me was starting to feel unreal, like a dream I couldn't wake up from. The hum of static was still there, hanging in the air, wrapping around me like a thick fog. I needed to get away, but where could I go? It wasn't just the voices anymore. It was everything. The air felt wrong, thick with something I couldn't see but could feel. I started walking, my feet moving on their own, dragging me through the empty streets. The city was eerily silent, yet the noise, the static, seemed to be everywhere. It was inside me. It was in the buildings. It was in the sky. I reached the park, the place where I used to walk to clear my mind. But now, the benches were empty, the paths covered in shadows that twisted unnaturally, stretching far longer than they should. The trees stood still, like silent sentinels, but their branches were bending on angles, swaying against an invisible wind. Please, don't leave me. It was her voice again, but this time it wasn't coming from behind me or my phone. It was inside my head, piercing through the static, clear as day. My hands shook as I gripped my head, trying to block it out. The woman. The man. I didn't understand what they wanted, but I could feel them with me. Always watching. Always waiting. I kept walking, my shoes scraping against the concrete. The farther I went, the more the park seemed to warp. The path I followed no longer led straight. It curled and twisted in impossible ways, as if the ground itself was rejecting me. The trees grew closer, their gnarled branches reaching down as though trying to grab me. And then I saw it. At the end of the path, just beyond the edge of the park, was a figure. But it wasn't human. It was like a shadow, a blur of motion that didn't belong. It flickered in and out of focus, its shape changing with every blink. One moment, it had a face, human, yet not, and the next, it was just an empty black void, an absence in the world. I froze. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My eyes were locked on the thing. It was watching me. Help me. The voice came again, but this time it was not just one. It was many. Multiple voices, overlapping, pleading, all in desperate unison. The shadows around the figure grew larger, shifting with the voices, bending the air in strange, unnatural ways. I felt the pull. A cold, invisible force tugging at me, dragging me forward, pulling me into the dark. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to see what was standing there. But it was too late. Before I could turn and run, the ground beneath me gave way. My feet slipped out from under me, and I found myself falling through darkness. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath out of me. I struggled to push myself up, my hands scraping against something cold and smooth. The air around me was thick with the hum of static, louder now, surrounding me, closing in. When my eyes adjusted, I saw where I was. It wasn't the park anymore. I was in a room. A small, dimly lit space with walls that seemed to pulse, breathing with a life of their own. The floor was slick, like glass, but darker. It reflected nothing, no light, no shadow. Just a void. And then I saw them. The figures from the voices. The woman, the man. They were standing in front of me, their forms flickering in and out, like old film, their faces still blurry, but their eyes, those eyes, were piercing, staring directly into me. Help me! I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. I was trapped, unable to escape their gaze. The woman stepped forward, her hand reaching out, her fingers stretching, elongating, like they were made of something else, something not entirely human. She spoke, her voice both in my ears and inside my head at once. Do you see us now? I couldn't answer. I couldn't even blink. The silence was suffocating. We are not gone, she continued, her voice soft but firm, a whisper that seemed to reverberate through my chest. We are still here. We never left. The man, who had been standing quietly beside her, suddenly moved. His face flickered again, shifting between different expressions, but they all held the same desperation, the same fear. We need you, he said, his voice low and crackling like an old radio. We need you to understand. It's not your fault. The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt the room shift, distort, like the walls were closing in. My heart pounded in my chest as the figures stepped closer, their faces warping in ways I couldn't comprehend. You have to help us, the woman's voice begged. Please, we're lost. Trapped, just like you. I wanted to speak, to ask what they meant, but the words wouldn't come. The static in the air, the hum, the oppressive silence, everything around me seemed to be closing in. My thoughts were muddled, tangled in the noise. Then, as quickly as it had started, the room went dark. The voices, the figures, they were gone. And I was left alone. But not truly alone. The static remained. I could feel them still. I sat there in the dark, trying to catch my breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. The silence was deafening, but somehow it felt worse than the static. The void of nothingness felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. The room had disappeared, leaving only the disorienting blackness. The voices were gone. But the static, it was still there, just under the surface. It hummed like an electric current, pulsating through the very air, waiting, lurking. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. I didn't know which way to go. It was impossible to orient myself in this endless night. I reached out, my hands brushing against something cold, smooth. It wasn't the glass floor anymore, it felt like metal. Thin, sharp. Like I could cut myself if I wasn't careful. And that thought, for some reason, brought a surge of panic. I wanted to scream, but the air felt like it was choking me. I couldn't make a sound. And yet, it didn't matter. The static was alive, twisting, turning, 1,000 voices swirling just beneath it, distant, fragmented, but unmistakably there. I couldn't escape them. I walked forward, though I wasn't sure why. There was no goal, no reason. It was just instinct, maybe. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing strangely in the dark. But it wasn't just the sound of my own steps. There was something else, something softer, something slower. Footsteps. I froze. They were behind me. It wasn't possible. I was alone, wasn't I? No one could have followed me. I hadn't seen anyone else, not since I had fallen into this place. But the footsteps, closer now, much closer, were real. I could feel the floor vibrate beneath them, like they were closing in. I turned around quickly, but saw nothing. Just the same impenetrable blackness that swallowed everything. "Who's there?" My voice cracked in the silence, desperate, but nothing answered. I took another step forward, then another, but the footsteps kept pace with me, almost mocking me. They were just out of my line of sight, just out of reach. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was racing, my breath shallow, ragged. I had to get out, but there was no way out. There was no escape from the static, from the voices, from the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, the static shifted. It wasn't just the same buzzing hum, it warped, like it was being distorted by some kind of unseen force. Then, a voice. It was clear this time, piercing through the static, cutting through everything. The voice was low, a whisper, but unmistakably real. "Do you hear us now?" I recognized it. It was the woman. The same voice that had begged me before, the one that had been inside my head. But now, it was louder, more urgent. "Please," she continued. "You have to understand. You can't leave us like this." I didn't know what she meant. Who were they? Why were they still here, in my head, in my mind? I wanted to ask, to demand answers, but every thought was slipping away. Every word I tried to form was drowned by the growing tide of static. I took another step forward. It felt like I was walking on glass, on thin ice. But as my foot landed, I felt something else beneath it, something soft, warm, like flesh. The ground beneath me was no longer solid. I gasped, stumbling backward, only to crash into something. Or someone. I spun around. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. The shape, whatever it was wrong. I couldn't make out its details, not clearly. But I could feel it, standing just inches away. I could feel its presence in my chest, in my bones, in the very marrow of my body. The static grew louder. The air around me hummed with the pressure of something too close. I could almost hear its breath, ragged and heavy, but it wasn't a sound I could place. The shape moved, shifting, flickering, a blur in the dark. I couldn't focus on it, couldn't understand it. And then, a voice, but not from the shape. It came from everywhere, from every direction. "Don't fight it." It was a man's voice this time, deep, smooth, almost soothing. But there was nothing soothing about it. His words crawled under my skin, making my hair stand on end. "You're one of us now," he said. I backed away, but the shape followed me. I could feel it circling me, always just out of my reach, always just behind me, as if it were waiting for the moment I would break. As if it was waiting for me to give in. And then, without warning, the static exploded into a scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was something else, something otherworldly. The sound ripped through my mind, tearing at the edges of my sanity, making my skin crawl. My body locked up, my chest constricting, my heart pounding in my throat. No! I screamed, but my voice was lost in the chaos. The shape was right in front of me now, its form solidifying in the midst of the noise, the static, the distortion. I saw its face. No, not a face. Not a human face. It was a mask, a twisted, horrifying mask that flickered with patches of darkness. Eyes that weren't eyes stared at me, unblinking. And then, just as quickly as it had come, everything stopped. The static faded. The shape vanished. And I was alone again. Except, I wasn't. I could feel them still. They were there. Watching. Waiting. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't escape them. Not now. Not ever. The silence was suffocating. It clung to me, heavy and oppressive, like I was trapped in a vacuum. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, something that pressed in on me from all sides, bending my thoughts, making everything feel wrong. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break free from this nightmare. But no sound came. My throat was dry, tight, as if something had clamped down on it. I was still in the same place, the same dark void, the same metallic floor beneath my feet. But it felt different now. The absence of noise, it wasn't peaceful. It was maddening. It was like the stillness was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make the next move. To give in. I stepped forward, trying to ground myself, to find something that felt real, something I could hold on to. My footsteps were the only thing breaking the silence, but they felt distant, as though they were echoing in a tunnel miles away. But I couldn't stop moving. I couldn't stand still. And then I heard it. A whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. Like a voice from far away, coming through the static, a voice I didn't recognize. It was distant, but close enough that it sent a chill crawling up my spine. Help us. The words were fragmented, distorted, like they were being pulled from some far-off place. Some other world. Help us, help. I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same voice. The woman. The one from before. I could feel her words, her desperation, slithering into my mind. I spun around, my eyes scanning the dark, searching for anything, anyone. There was nothing. Just shadows. Empty space. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. Please, you have to listen. They are coming. I was shaking. I couldn't breathe. The static was back, humming in my ears, louder now. It was as if it was getting inside me, crawling under my skin, ripping apart my thoughts. Who? I shouted, but again, no sound escaped my lips. I could feel the words, but they didn't leave my mouth. The pressure in my chest grew, suffocating. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the ground beneath me shifted again. It wasn't metal anymore. It felt soft. Alive. It felt like skin. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing, but something held me up, something in the air. I could feel it pressing on me, pulling at me, like invisible hands grasping at my limbs. It was pulling me deeper, pulling me into the darkness. I tried to resist. I tried to move, to fight back, but the air around me thickened. It wrapped around me, restricting my movements. I could feel it tightening, like a noose around my body. I couldn't breathe. Get away from me. I tried to scream, but the words stayed locked inside my mind, caught in the void. And then, suddenly, the lights flickered on. Not overhead. No. They came from the walls, small, pulsing lights that blinked erratically, casting strange, elongated shadows across the room. It was blinding at first, but soon my eyes adjusted. And I saw it. A figure. Not human. Not anything I had ever seen before. It was a silhouette at first, just a shape, a dark outline against the glowing lights. But it moved. It shifted, and as it did, I could see it more clearly. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with arms that seemed to stretch endlessly into the air. Its form was wrong, like a twisted reflection, its proportions all wrong. Its face, if you could even call it that, was nothing more than a mask, distorted and shifting. The features changed, melted, reformed, but the eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, remained the same. They were staring right at me. And for a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The static, the voices, the darkness, it all vanished. And in that moment, there was nothing but those eyes, those unblinking, empty eyes, staring into me, through me, into the very core of my soul. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the floor, my body paralyzed with fear. I could feel the cold sweat dripping down my back. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. The figure moved closer. I could hear it now, its slow, deliberate steps, each one vibrating through the air. It was getting closer. I could hear its breath. No, not breath. It was the sound of air being drawn in and pushed out, deep and unnatural, like it didn't belong in this world. And then it spoke. You're not supposed to be here. Its voice was low, guttural, but it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, 100 voices, layered on top of each other, all whispering the same thing. The sound was suffocating, like I was being crushed under the weight of 1,000 souls. You're not supposed to be here. And then it reached for me. I tried to scream. I tried to pull away, but it was too late. Its hand, if you could call it a hand, touched my face, cold as ice, and in that instant, everything shattered. The lights. The room. The figure. It all splintered into nothing. And then, silence. Total, complete silence. But I knew it wasn't over. I didn't know why I kept looking at it, but I couldn't stop. It was a photo of me. A photo I had never seen before, yet I was certain it was me in it. But something was wrong. Something didn't belong. I had been cleaning out some old boxes in the attic, looking for something, anything, to distract me from the emptiness of the place. It was a dull Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, unsettling. The attic was cluttered with forgotten memories, things that once mattered, now just collecting dust. That's when I found it. A worn envelope tucked behind a stack of old letters. The photo inside was yellowed with age, edges curled slightly. At first glance, I thought it was just another faded picture from a family gathering. But as I looked closer, something caught my eye. The background. I knew that place. Or I thought I did. It was a wooded area near the old house I had grown up in. But I had never been there, not like this. In the picture, I was standing alone under a dark tree, looking directly into the camera. But there was no one there to take it. I was standing in the middle of the woods, in a place I had never visited, at least not that I could remember. I blinked, feeling a chill creep up my spine. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe I was imagining things. But the longer I stared at the photo, the more uneasy I became. My fingers trembled as I turned it over. No writing, no date. Just a blank, ghostly backside. Why do you look like that? I whispered to myself. My face in the photo wasn't smiling. It was hollow, empty. Something was missing. There was a darkness in my eyes, a hollow, soulless look that sent a shiver through my bones. I shoved the photo back into the envelope and tried to shake it off. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the image, the unsettling sensation, it stayed with me. That night, after the sun had long gone down and the darkness swallowed the house whole, I sat at my desk. I had placed the photo in front of me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. The shadows in the room felt closer, the air heavier. I glanced at the clock, midnight. Suddenly, I heard something. A faint, almost imperceptible rustling sound, like paper crinkling. It came from the direction of the photo. My breath caught in my throat. I looked at the picture. Something was different. The trees in the background, their shapes were sharper, more defined. The dark shadows in the woods now looked like figures. Human figures. They were standing in the distance, barely visible, but they were there. And I could feel them staring at me. I blinked. They weren't there a moment ago. I was sure of it. I reached out for the photo, my hand shaking. I held it closer to my face, studying every detail. The figures in the background were clearer now, darker, more solid, and they were moving. But they were moving in a natural way. They twisted unnaturally, their forms bending in on angles, like something was distorting their very essence. I could feel their presence, as if they were crawling out from the picture itself. "Get out," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. But I couldn't look away. I could feel my pulse quicken. My mind was racing. What was happening? I had to stop this. I had to get rid of the photo. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. But then, the figures began to move closer. I could see their faces now, or what was left of them. Their eyes were hollow, black voids, and their mouths, they were twisted into shapes that weren't human. They seemed to be stretching, like they were trying to reach out from the picture itself. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the room deepened. I couldn't breathe. The photo, no, the image in the photo, it was changing. Shifting. The background was no longer just woods. There were trees, yes, but also strange, jagged rocks and dark, swirling clouds overhead. It wasn't right. It was a place I didn't know, a place I didn't want to know. I backed away from the photo, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I had to destroy it. I had to get rid of it. I couldn't keep it in the house any longer. But when I reached for it, I felt a coldness in the air, like someone or something was standing right behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I looked down at the photo again. The figures were closer now, their eyes more defined. They were staring at me, their mouths moving silently, as if calling to me, beckoning me to join them. I had to leave. I had to get away from this place. But as I moved to stand, my vision blurred. The photos slipped from my hands, falling onto the floor with a soft thud. When I looked down, I froze. It was different now. There was something new. In the corner of the photo, just outside the frame where I had been standing, there was a shadow. A figure, more solid now, loomed, its face twisted in a grotesque expression, its eyes burning with a malevolent glow. It was smiling. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the photo started to change again. The shadow was growing, stretching into the picture, until it was no longer just a shadow. It was a person. No, not a person. Something else. Something far worse. And it was looking right at me. I backed away from the photo, my legs trembling. But before I could move any further, a sound, soft, almost like a whisper, came from the photo. "Come closer." The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's I knew. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to listen. But my eyes, they were locked. I couldn't tear them away. I had to know. And that's when the figure in the photo stepped out of the frame. I could feel its presence. I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. And in that moment, I knew. It was only just beginning. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the photo as if my very soul was trapped within its depths. Time didn't seem to move. I could feel the temperature drop in the room, the air turning thick and heavy. The shadows, they were moving. The figure from the photo, no, it wasn't just a figure anymore. It was here, in the room with me. I could feel it pressing in on me, the coldness wrapping around my body like an icy shroud. But it didn't touch me. Not yet. I slowly backed away from the photo, my legs weak beneath me. Every step felt like a battle. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the image, even as I felt the floor beneath me tremble. The shadow in the picture was no longer confined to the corner. It was stretching, bending unnaturally, its dark tendrils crawling out of the frame like they were searching for something. I had to get out. I had to destroy it. I could feel that primal urge, that need to escape, rising within me. But where could I go? The photo, the thing in it, was everywhere. It had found me. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a doorway, a portal. And I had opened it. I reached for the photo, my fingers trembling as I tried to pick it up. As soon as my hand brushed against the edge of the frame, I felt a jolt, a shock running through my body. I pulled my hand back instinctively, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the photo, waiting for the next movement, the next change. But nothing happened. The figure had stopped moving. The shadows seemed to still. It was like the room had gone quiet again, but the silence was thick, suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, louder than ever. I exhaled slowly, almost relieved. I thought maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was all just some twisted trick of the light. Maybe I had been seeing things. Then the whisper came again. "Come closer." This time, it wasn't soft. It wasn't a whisper. It was a command, urgent and demanding, a sound that didn't belong to the room, but to something much darker. I couldn't ignore it. My hands shook as I reached for the photo again, my mind fighting against the instinct to run. I had to know. I had to understand. What was this? What was happening to me? Why was I being haunted by this thing? As soon as my fingers touched the edge, the room seemed to go dark. The walls around me stretched, bending, warping as though the very space itself was folding in on me. My vision blurred, and I could see the shadows shifting, coiling, crawling along the walls like they were alive. I gasped, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The room felt endless, the walls closing in, the air suffocating. "Look at me," the voice whispered again. This time, it was different, closer. It was coming from the photo. No, it was coming from inside my head. Inside my very bones. I tried to move, tried to escape, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Every inch I tried to move felt like it took all of my strength. I had to break free. I had to stop this. And then I saw it. The figure, no longer just a shadow, was standing at the edge of the photo, its face now fully visible. It was smiling, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was twisted, distorted, a grin too wide for a human mouth. Its eyes were empty, black voids, and they stared at me, unblinking, unfeeling. I felt my heart race in my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if my voice had been stolen. I could see the figure reaching toward me. Its long, unnaturally thin fingers stretched out, cracking as if they were made of brittle bone. The darkness around me thickened, swirling like a storm, and I could hear the faint sound of a low, guttural laugh coming from the figure in the photo. "Come closer," it repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. I tried to look away, to break the connection, but it was like the photo had taken hold of my very mind. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't look away from those eyes, those black, soulless eyes. The room was no longer a room. It was a void, a place where reality and nightmare bled together. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the floor seemed to ripple beneath me, shifting like water. And then, with a snap, the photo changed again. This time, the figures in the background were clearer. They weren't just standing there anymore. They were moving closer. They were stepping out of the shadows, becoming more real, more tangible. Their faces were twisted, deformed, like something had melted their skin, and their mouths hung open as if they were speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I wanted to run. I needed to escape. But I couldn't. I felt my body freezing, my legs refusing to move. The figure in the photo, the one with the twisted grin, began to step out of the frame. Slowly, deliberately, it reached toward me, its long fingers brushing the edge of reality itself. And then, it spoke one last time. "Come closer." "I'm waiting." And that was when I understood. The photo wasn't just showing me something. It was pulling me in. It was opening the door, and if I didn't stop it, I was going to walk right through. The air in the room was thick with a palpable sense of dread, each breath heavier than the last. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My body was frozen, locked in place, as if every muscle had betrayed me. The figure in the photo was no longer just a distorted image. It was now standing right in front of me, inches away. Its eyes, those deep, endless voids, were boring into mine as though it was peering into the very depths of my soul. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, the thumping growing louder and louder with each second, a frantic rhythm that felt like it was going to tear me apart. The darkness around us seemed to close in tighter, the walls pressing down like a vice. There was no escape. I couldn't escape. "Come closer," the voice repeated, now rasping, cold whisper that sent chills down my spine. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break free of this nightmare. But my body refused to obey. It was like I was trapped inside my own skin, powerless, helpless. And then, the thing from the photo, this creature, took a step toward me. Its fingers, long and gnarled like twisted branches, reached out, brushing against my face. I could feel the icy touch as though it was seeping into my very skin, crawling beneath it, leaving a trail of frost behind. I gasped, a strangled sound caught in my throat. I tried to pull away, but my feet were rooted to the floor. My hands trembled as I reached for anything, any source of comfort, but there was nothing. Only the relentless gaze of those empty eyes, staring right through me. Why? I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. What do you want from me? The creature's grin widened, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long, like rows of broken glass. It didn't answer me in words. Instead, it stepped even closer, its breath cold and rancid, filling the space between us. A low, guttural laugh rumbled from deep within its throat, reverberating through my skull. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a vibration in my bones that left me dizzy, disoriented. I felt like I was sinking into something far darker, far deeper than I could comprehend. I looked down at the photo in my hands, the edges now cold and sharp, as if the paper itself was turning to ice. The image had shifted again. The background was darker, the figures in the distance now closer, closer than before. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were forms, human-shaped but wrong, twisted and deformed. Faces contorted in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. But they weren't just watching me. They were reaching out, their hands stretching toward me, as if they were begging to pull me into the photo, into their world. I couldn't take it. I couldn't stand it anymore. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I ripped the photo away from my hands, tearing it in half. The sound of the paper shredding was deafening, but as soon as the photo was torn, the room fell silent. The weight lifted from my chest, and for a moment, I thought, no, I hoped that it was over, that I had won. But then, the photo began to repair itself. The pieces of the torn photo floated back together, the edges curling, fusing as if by some unseen force. Slowly, the image restored itself, the figures in the background returning to their places, the creature in the foreground standing taller, more menacing than before. It hadn't been stopped. It had only been delayed. I dropped the photo to the ground, stepping back in a panic. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind reeling. This wasn't just a trick. This wasn't just some hallucination. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. And it was coming for me. The walls of the room began to distort again, the space stretching, bending in unnatural ways, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The shadows were no longer just creeping along the walls. They were growing, expanding, reaching out like tendrils to engulf everything in their path. The room was collapsing in on itself, folding inwards as though it were being sucked into the photo, into whatever dark realm it contained. I had to escape. I had to leave before it was too late. But where could I go? The door, was it even a door anymore? It had become a dark void, an endless tunnel of shadows, stretching into nothingness. And then I saw it. A reflection in the mirror. No, it wasn't a reflection. It was me. But it wasn't me. The figure in the mirror was smiling, that same twisted grin from the photo, but it wasn't my face anymore. It was something else. Something far worse. My heart skipped a beat. The figure in the mirror, the creature, it stepped closer to the glass, reaching through it. The mirror was no longer solid, it rippled like water, and as the creature's hand reached through, it felt like it was pulling at the very fabric of reality. It was coming. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind completely, I heard it, the faintest sound, like the rustling of paper. I looked down, and the photo, now completely restored, was lying on the floor in front of me, as if mocking my efforts. But something was different. It wasn't the same photo. In the corner, beneath the creature's feet, there was something new. A date. The date was today. The sight of the date, today's date, was like a punch to the gut. My knees went weak, and I staggered back, my mind struggling to keep up with the madness unfolding before me. I blinked, staring at the photo, hoping I had imagined it. But no! The date was clear, bold, unmistakable. It wasn't just the photo that was changing. It was everything around me. The walls of the room seemed to pulse, the air thick with a sense of wrongness that was suffocating. The shadows that had once been harmless now seemed alive, moving with purpose, creeping towards me like dark fingers reaching for my throat. I could hear the whispering again, the same cold, raspy voice, but this time it was louder, clearer. "Come closer," it hissed. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen, as if the very air was holding me in place. I stared at the photo on the floor. The figures in it, the ones that had once been so far in the background, were now unmistakable. They were closer, their faces clearer, and I could see them, each one twisted in agony, their eyes locked on me with an expression of hunger, of need. One of them, a woman with hollow eyes and cracked skin, seemed to tilt her head slightly, as if she recognized me, as if she knew me. I couldn't tear my gaze away from her. It was like a compulsion, a pull from deep within the pit of my stomach. Something inside me told me that I had to understand, that I had to know what this was. But the closer I looked, the more I felt it, the overwhelming sense of danger, of doom. Then, something shifted. The photo, it began to move. The figures in the photo didn't just remain static anymore. They blinked. The woman with the hollow eyes moved her head slowly, as though she were surveying her surroundings, but she wasn't just looking at the other figures in the photo. She was looking at me. I backed away from it, stumbling in a panic, my chest tightening with each breath. But no matter how far I moved, the photo stayed in my peripheral vision, like a constant, looming presence. And then, as though answering a question I hadn't even asked, the woman's lips parted. "Come closer," she whispered. Her voice was soft, but it cut through me like a blade. I felt it in my bones, deep in my core, pulling at me, urging me to approach the photo. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I shook my head, my mind screaming for me to stay away. But as I turned to run, I felt a cold hand, icy, like death itself, wrap around my wrist. I spun around, but there was nothing there, nothing physical holding me. Yet, the coldness lingered, crawling up my arm, seeping into my skin like a sickness. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing down, the air growing thick with the scent of decay. The darkness seemed to be alive now, swirling, shifting, as if it were feeding on my fear. "Look," the voice hissed again, louder now. "Look at what you've done." I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what I had done. But something told me that whatever it was, it had been set into motion long ago. I had become part of something far larger than myself, something that stretched beyond the boundaries of the room, beyond time itself. I turned my head back toward the photo. The woman with the hollow eyes was still watching me, but now others had joined her. Figures, once distant and blurry, were now stepping forward, emerging from the shadows of the photo. They were coming to life. Each figure, each face, was distorted by pain, by terror, but their eyes, they were locked onto me, and I couldn't tear myself away. They were no longer just images. They were real. I could see them, feel them, as if they were in the room with me. The woman reached her hand out, her long fingers twisting, beckoning me forward. "Come closer," she repeated, her voice now a shrill, high-pitched whisper that crawled beneath my skin, making my teeth ache. I couldn't resist. I didn't want to resist, even though every part of me screamed to run. But it was like something inside me had broken. Something had shifted, and I felt drawn to the photo. I had to look closer. I had to know what was going on. I slowly lowered myself to the floor, my hands trembling as I reached for the edges of the photo. My fingers brushed the surface, and a jolt of electricity shot through my body as if the photo itself was alive. My mind spun, my vision blurred. And then everything stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just an eerie, suffocating silence. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter. The photo had taken a new picture. I could see it now, clearly. There I was, standing in the photo, next to the woman with the hollow eyes. But there was something wrong. Something that made my stomach twist in horror. It wasn't me anymore. It was a stranger. A person I didn't recognize. But somehow, I knew it was me, but not. It was as if the photo had swallowed me, and now there was something else in my place. A figure, distorted, warped, its face contorted in agony. And then I understood. The photo wasn't just changing. It was taking me, piece by piece. My identity, my soul. I had to leave. But as I stood up, the room began to spin, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned, and there, standing right behind me, was the woman. She smiled. "Welcome," she whispered. And everything went black. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. The room around me was still and silent, but it felt wrong, as if the very air was thick with something unexplainable. My hands shook as I reached up to wipe the sweat from my brow. My mind was foggy, disoriented, and the remnants of the nightmare clung to me like a shadow. I was still in my room, at least, it looked like my room. The walls were the same, the furniture in the same places, but something about it felt off. The shadows were deeper, longer, and the light from the windows seemed dimmer, as if the world outside had dulled somehow. I took a slow, shaky breath, trying to steady myself. The photo. It was gone. There was no trace of it on the floor, no sign of the horror that had been in my hands just moments before. Had it all been a dream? I looked around the room again, my gaze lingering on every corner, as if expecting something to jump out at me. Nothing. The room felt empty, save for the oppressive silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare, that my mind had simply conjured up the photo, the woman, the voices, everything. It didn't make sense. How could a photo change? How could I be pulled into it? It was ridiculous. I was just imagining things, right? But then I saw it. A cold chill ran down my spine as I spotted the corner of something glinting on the far side of the room. I approached it slowly, my legs stiff, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I got closer, the shape became clearer. There, lying on the floor, was a photo. The same one. My blood ran cold. I knelt down and picked it up, my hands trembling. The image was distorted, blurred, like it had been torn apart and put back together. But there was no mistaking it. The woman with the hollow eyes. The twisted figures in the background. And there, standing in the center, was me, only now, it was different. My face was no longer mine. It was contorted, pale, and hollow, the same as the figures in the background. I could see the woman reaching out, her hand stretched toward me, and it looked like she was trying to pull me into the photo. The edges of the photo were fraying, as if something was trying to break through from the other side. I stumbled back, dropping the photo as if it had burned me. It slid across the floor and came to a stop at the edge of the room. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time. They weren't coming from the photo, but from everywhere. Behind me. Above me. Around me. Come closer, they said. The air thickened, pressing in on me, suffocating me. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the shadows in the corners shifting, moving. I could feel the coldness creeping toward me, as if someone, was closing in. I had to get out. I turned and ran toward the door, my heart racing. But as I reached for the handle, the whispers turned into screams of torment, of agony. They clawed at my mind, each one more intense than the last. I tried to block them out, but they were inside my head, all around me. I could feel the temperature drop, my breath visible in the air as though the room itself had turned into ice. With one last desperate effort, I threw open the door and bolted into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the windows. The silence was almost deafening, but the pressure in the air, the heaviness of the darkness, still clung to me. I stumbled down the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly in the otherwise empty house. The photos, the woman, the voices, everything was a blur, a jumble of images that wouldn't leave my mind. I couldn't understand it. I didn't know what was happening, or why it was happening to me. I reached the front door and threw it open, rushing out into the cool night air. The world outside felt almost normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers were still there, in my ears, in my mind. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape her. And then, as I looked down at the ground, my heart stopped. There, at my feet, was the broken photo. The one I had dropped in the room. But now it was different. The photo had changed again. My face in it was even more distorted, more twisted than before. The woman's hand was now fully stretched out of the photo, and her fingers were almost touching me. I bent down to pick it up, but as I touched the edges, I felt a sharp, freezing pain shoot through my fingers. I pulled my hand back quickly, but not before seeing the last, most horrifying detail. The date had changed. It was no longer today's date. It was tomorrow's. And the day after that. And the day after that. It was endless. And at the bottom of the photo, in black ink, were words that I had never seen before. Welcome to the end. And in that moment, I knew I had become part of it. And there was no way out. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.